My name is Angel Palermo. I chair a longstanding community and academic partnership called the Harlem Community and Academic Partnership, HCAP. I'm also a board member of the Community Campus Partnerships for Health. Has everyone heard of CCPH? Yes, no? Well, you're going to hear about it now. CCPH, I've been connected to CCPH probably for the past 11 years or so, and it is really the only national organization national nonprofit organization that really is a voice for community partners, community representatives, individuals, organizations who are engaged in research. And our mission is to promote health broadly defined through partnerships between communities and higher educational institutions. Now, obviously, that's not the only way partnerships can be formulated and created. And you're going to hear from different folks today about what partnerships look like and who can be on either end. Because it can also happen within communities, partnerships within communities to do research. And so we want to have you think about what does partnership look for yourself as an organization that you're representing here today, and what does that mean to promote health? We're very committed to using partnerships as a platform to achieve health equity and social justice, and we're open to creating dialogue wherever we can at the neighborhood level to the national level about really making sure that the resources to cultivate and nurture longstanding partnerships happen. And so you're going to hear about later today some of the work that we did lobbying for not only resources but acknowledgement and commitment from our congressional elected officials. So I'm excited that Serena and Elmer will share a little bit later. I just want to say a little bit more, just that we are a 12-member board. There are past board members in the room, including Elmer and Daniel. I'm not sure if I'm missing anyone else. There, Eileen, sorry, or Barbara. I just got on a year ago, so forgive me if I didn't recognize you. It's been quite an amazing experience so far. I'm excited to what comes ahead for CCPH in our next decade. For over, how old are we now? 15 years. And still running. We definitely have a wide reach. The reason why we're here today is because, more importantly, we want to cultivate a New York City network and really be a model for other networks, especially along the Northeast. We started in Boston, bringing people across the country, but we want to make sure that we can start creating local networks for community-based organizations, community representatives, and so forth. So I think the last thing I just wanted to share are our goals, and you can read them here. These elements are threaded through all of the presentations you hear about today. Each of us will talk about it in our own way and based from our own experiences. And we look forward to hearing what your experiences have been as well, and what your thoughts are about if you are doing this work already, what's working, what's not working, if you're thinking about it, to talk to those of us who are in it so that we can have a conversation so that you know that you're fully informed of what it means to be in a partnership and engage in research in a partnership approach.
And I know you're all here because you're really passionate about community and about using research for a purpose, knowledge for change, for social justice, for action, for health equity. You're all here because you believe that we can make a difference through research when it's conducted truly in a community-based participatory way. And you're going to hear on this panel from 3 really wonderful community leaders who have been at this for a long time and have a lot of experience, lessons learned, and wisdom to share about their experiences with community-university partnerships, with community-engaged research, and with using research really to ultimately influence practice and policy. And what we're hoping really throughout this whole day is to be able to demonstrate that this can be done. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are some really horrific stories and examples of research that has been done in an unethical way, in an opposite way to involving communities, and in a very top-down way. But it also can be done with a new paradigm of participation from communities and really community-driven research. So we want you to be able to leave this day with models, with examples, with contacts, with mentors, and as Angel said, with a network that really can help support each other, all of us over time. I think it's important for you to know that we really emphasize community participation in this forum. We were contacted by quite a few academics that do community-based research, are just as passionate about this as community, but we really felt, they should encourage their partners to come to this meeting and help form the network among the partners. There are a lot of other venues for academics and professional development within the university realm, and we wanted to carve out a safe and productive space for communities, so wanted to share that up front. So we're going to hear from 3 individuals here in a moment. You have really extensive bios in your packet, so I'm not going to read them. But Eileen Leach is the Chief of Staff for the Urban Health Plan. Peggy Shepard, immediately to my left, is co-founder and executive director of We Act, which is We Act for Environmental Justice, West Harlem Environmental Action, and also on the board of my organization, Community Campus Partnerships for Health. And Ray Cornbill, who's had a long and really illustrious career in public health, health services, and public service here in New York City, and he'll be speaking last. So without further ado, we've asked each panelist to speak for maybe about 15 minutes in terms of their experience and the information they want to share, and then we're going to open it up for dialogue among the panelists and with all of you. So I believe Angel circulated some index cards. I don't know if we're using those later, but the idea, is if you have questions as people are speaking, jot them down so you're ready to ask them, so we can jump right in when the panel finishes. So let me turn the mic over to Eileen, and I think you wanted to step up.
Guess what? The NIH has gotten alerted to the fact that the academic medical centers and the community-based practitioners are not always in accord. Yeah, no. Have we been telling them? I was telling them when I was the medical director at Roche. I was telling them when I was the chief of the clinical research at Columbia. But guess what? They got it, and they gave us a grant. That giving us, it means that, move to the next one. What's really happening is that Albert Einstein and Urban Health Plan, which is a federally qualified healthcare center in the South Bronx, and we have a site in Queens too, got a grant. Now, it's $1 million in 3 years. It's a lot of money, but it's not really a lot of money when you come from industry where you know that they like their cigars with $5 bills. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this whole deal about our shared vision, but when we got together, we had to say, I'm as worthy of being here as you are. And we have to start out with a shared vision about why we're here. And you can read it, it's in the thing. But respect and understanding was one of the first things that we really cared about. And then making it sustainable. Let's not just do it for 3 years and then never see each other again. I can see it's like this. So we needed to be successful. It had to be community-based. It had to involve training. It had to involve building a required infrastructure. It had to do impacting on policy and enhancing community health, or else why the heck were we there? All right, and then we had to communicate within our institutions and with other. Now I have to say to you that our chief medical officer, who's on this group, said to the academics, you know what I do, because you go to the doctor, but I don't know what you do. So we needed to find a way to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so in phase 1, we did an in-depth evaluation of what we were already doing, because some of it that you do is casual. You don't even know you're doing it, but you really are. So we had to say, look, just a minute, we're doing quality assurance, we're doing quality improvement. That counts. It may not be an NIH grant, but it counts. And then what we had to do is implement an infrastructure. I'm very, very sure that a CBO cannot exist with a big institution unless there's somebody at the CBO who is the point person. And that point person has to be very knowledgeable, has to be in it and really, and that's their job. It's not something they do on the side. It's their job. Next slide, please. So in phase 3, we went back and we looked at all of the urban health players. Quality improvement. We have wonderful quality improvement that has delivered care to 8,000 asthmatics, has delivered care to 3,000 HIV positive people. I mean, we had things that we were doing that were really good. They may not have been answering a research question, but they certainly were improving the care to the point where you could ask the next question. In phase 4, we went with we want our own providers to develop investigator-initiated trials. Now, let me tell you what my concept of that is. I noticed that what I'm doing isn't working as well as it could. And maybe I could add this, and so I do, because I'm free to write what I want to write. And I'm saying to them, wait a second, that's a clinical trial. You just put somebody on an additive, and that's a clinical trial. That's not an approved use. You now need to get sponsorship for looking at that in depth. And then phase 5 is to evaluate the infrastructure so it's sustainable. I don't want this to go away just because we have the end of the NIH grant. It should have been a stimulus. Next slide. Okay, so we started a clinical research seminar. Here are some of the things that we've already done. I'm not going to read them because you can read them for yourselves. They're on the paper. I needed to have my providers at UHP have the same language as the investigators at Albert Einstein. You think that something means the same. It doesn't. And to them, they are driven in that clinical research world. And I wanted my investigators to be able to have a conversation with them that with the investigators at UHP were empowered with language. So we brought in very wonderful people to actually give us, people have heard of an IRB, but you know that they're death-defying to write an IRB application. And it's nothing. Franco worked with me at Hopkins Roche, and he also worked with me at Columbia. Franco has done 5 supplemental NDAs, meaning that you took a drug like Rocephin and you said it can be used in otitis media. Well, you can't do that unless you study it. And Franco studied it, or had a group of people study it, and he filed for an extension too. So I'm telling you, you have no idea that these things are not as hard as you think they are. You follow the rules. The FDA puts them out there, you follow each line. All right? Yep.
I'm going to be the acronym czar for the session.
Oh.
And I just wanted you to explain an IRB and also an NDA.
An institutional review board means that what you're doing is ethical to do. Years ago, people did whatever they did. And when I talk years ago, I mean when I got into this in the 60s, you did whatever you wanted to do. You wanted to give somebody a shot of something, you did it. But now there are ethical considerations because naturally they were abused. Anything that's used is abused. So they put in place an institutional review board. Thank you. And the other one was?
NDA.
The NDA is a new drug application. So when you want to use a drug in the full market, the FDA, which is the Federal Drug Administration, actually gives you permission through what they call an NDA, or a new drug application. They say yes, they say no. And that's how drugs come to the market. Okay, so we had, and this is exactly what I'm talking about, that we didn't speak the same language. All right, and then we're going to have a boot camp for our clinical investigators, where they go and they have to do every single thing. Ooh, wow. That they have to do every single thing that investigators at the academic center do. Next slide, please. Okay, so guess what? Miraculously, Albert Einstein had no problem with this. Once you explained what you had to do and where we were coming from, and look what we've done. We've submitted grants on cervical cancer in teenagers, all right? And we're doing it through a share. In other words, a young Latina girl comes, they don't like pap smears because it gives all sorts of other indications culturally. So they come and have a pap smear, and then they say, oh, it's fine, and now you should bring your girlfriend. And they get rewarded for bringing their friends to do pap smears. It's just a new way of looking at a community getting involved and helping each other. Postpartum smoking relapse. We have a population of women who stop smoking when they're pregnant because they know. They've been well educated. But guess what? They walk out the door with the baby, they light up. And most of it is influenced by what happens at home. So if they have a partner who smokes, so now it's not just getting to the woman who smokes, it's getting to her family, it's getting to her community about smoking. So that's good. That's another submission. We're already doing pre-dementia in our elderly population. Do you know there are 0 studies on Latinas or Latino population in pre-dementia? 0. That's not someplace they went. They went to the old white men. Because you know that most clinical trials are driven that way. So now we're doing it in Latino population, pre-dementia. And one of the things, at Urban Health Plan, we have a life enhancement program for all our patients. It's a model from Canyon Ranch. Canyon Ranch is a very fancy place out in Arizona that Jennifer Aniston goes to. So I'm figuring what's good enough for Jennifer is good enough for us. So we got a grant from the Canyon Ranch Foundation to do this for our diabetic patients. We had 8 people started. They are now in their 2nd year of this life enhancement. Every single one of them is off their drugs. Every single one of them has lost weight. And has kept it off. I mean, let me tell you, Canyon Ranch works. Jennifer's not going to be putting her money down if it doesn't work. So here's the deal. We want it for us. And we go on and on and on. So now I'm saying, I have HIV positive patients. Who needs it more than an HIV positive person? Let's get a little life enhancement program for the HIV. And Bruce Rapkin, who's from Albert Einstein, is helping us put together a program so that we can get funding for that. All right? And we got the data. Okay, next. Okay, so, of course, you're nothing unless you're published, don't we know? And when I look around at the population of our providers, I don't see people who are especially interested in publishing. What they're interested in is seeing the next patient, get the next patient better, the next patient, the next patient. So we said, stop, new story. What you're doing has to be written down. And it's got to be vetted. And so we submitted to the journal. The abstract was accepted. Hold your breath. It's under review. So I don't care what religion you are, please light a candle, burn money, whatever you need to do. We got to have a publication. That's very important. And Barbara and her crowd are going to the CCPH, and they're presenting a poster session on this collaborative that we've done with the academics. That's going to be in Houston in April, and I know it's a long way, and I know it's Texas. But we're going to go anyway. Okay, so now, the best way for it not to go away at UHP is for us to have our own community-based research program. A bona fide, in our place, an infrastructure that's sustainable for us. So I went out and looked for somebody I knew, of course, from all these years, and Franco Brisante. Dr. Brisante has joined us as the director of our community-based. So what are we doing? We want to put increased emphasis on community-based research, so we have to gather input from our community through their providers. Their providers tell them what they need. Then, the community traditionally is not consulted when it comes to, is not provided. I'm on my list. So, we're going to make sure that the community gets to talk, and we're doing a lot of focus groups with the Albert Einstein and with the community directors, clinical directors network. We're doing a lot of focus groups with our people so that they're really getting a voice. And then the results of the findings are often not felt. This is the controversial slide. They're not felt in the community. Things are done, patients are seen, they go away. You don't even know, did they publish it, did they change policy, you don't know anything. So they look at all their heads nodding. Anybody who's worked at this knows this. And you know what, we felt this at the pharmaceutical company too. We would say, what's happened, because you know, you do things with sales. You don't do things for the good of the community. And when you don't see the sales going anyplace, you know you've not touched that community. Okay, so one of the best things, if you don't have one, think about this, an electronic medical record. Electronic medical record allowed us to do continuity of care. That was the most important thing. Then we did quality improvement, saying this is good, but we could be better. We're going to take a bunch of 65-year-old men with an A1C, that's a blood sugar, and say to them, we're going to put you through a 6-week boot camp, and your A1C is going to go down. And guess what? It does, because we're focused on them, and we're talking to them, and we're saying to them, did you get your medication? Because can I tell you, you write a script, you don't know the patient's going to take that medication, whether they're going to get it, or they're going to buy dog food, or whatever. You have to follow up. That's care management. And that all leads to research. Why don't people do things? That's research. Not that you do it, but why don't they do it? What are the issues around that? That's research. So last slide, next slide, is it's got to go both ways. The people who are clinicians have got to respect that the academicians have brought the science here, that they are living through the experience of the scientists. It shouldn't be this. It should be this. It should be translational science. Hal just walked in, and I heard Hal's name all day yesterday. Every place I went yesterday, I heard about Hal. But I know Hal from our NIH grant. So that's what we have to be able to know, that the services that you are delivering now have their root in science. So you have to respect that. Okay, next slide.
Justice, based here in Harlem. And our dream and our vision is that all residents will have access to clean water, clean air, equal environmental enforcement and protection, and equitable land use and zoning, because so many of our community residents around this country are dying from disproportionate environmental exposure to pollution, toxins, and policies. So that's the context of our organization. That's our vision. So our organization used to be right across the street on 125th Street, and we look at 8 indicators of a healthy community. We look at healthy indoor environments, sustainable land use, sanitary waste management, reduced use of toxic products, clean air quality, access to good food in schools, public mobility and transportation, and the use of open and green space. And so we work to build healthy communities by assuring that people of color engage meaningfully in the development of policies and practices that improve environmental health and environmental protection. So that's the context for our organization and for our partnerships. So just to let you know a little bit about Northern Manhattan, which is where you're situated. Small area of 7.4 square miles, over 600,000 people, mostly African American and Latino, low income. We're in a non-attainment area for clean air standards. We're ranked number 1 in New York City for air toxics and cancer risk by the EPA. We have some of the highest asthma rates in the nation. And we know that the key determinants of health are race, class, and environmental community conditions. So we also know that studies link the built environment to people's health. And so that, again, is the context for the kinds of research that we do. Now, we are part of grassroots organizations working on environmental justice around this country. There are hundreds of groups like ours, small community-based organizations. We act as an organization that runs from about 10 to 15 staff. Our budget is about $1.5 million, and we are now almost 25 years old. And our movement has realized that evidence-based campaigns really move policymakers and empower community residents. And so back in 1994, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences convened 1,000 people at a conference in Washington, the first time the grassroots folks came together with scientists. And the concept was to begin to develop the kind of research and partnerships that would begin to reduce the health disparities and environmental exposures that are creating some of the health disparities in our communities. So because of a number of community struggles in this community around the siting of polluting facilities, and that's how my organization got started, mobilizing residents to hold the city accountable for emissions from sewage plants, diesel bus depots, all of these kinds of things that really contribute to negative health outcomes. Because of those struggles, we reached out to the Columbia School of Public Health and Harlem Hospital to begin to understand what our exposures were and what those health outcomes were as well. And so we began a 12-year partnership with the 2 research centers at the Columbia School of Public Health. One is a basic research center, and I am co-director of the Community Outreach and Education Corps there. And the other center is the Columbia Children's Environmental Health Research Center, where I'm a co-PI of the Community Outreach and Translational Research Corps. And so together we started out with real CBPR projects, engaging our Earth Crew youth in collecting data through looking at traffic counts, standing right out here at 125th Street with traffic counters, looking how many trucks, buses. We worked with researchers at Columbia to do air monitoring at key intersections. And out of that, we developed and co-authored 2 papers in Environmental Health Perspectives looking at the impact of diesel on school children in this community, as well as looking at the airborne concentrations of fine particles at intersections in this community. And why were we interested in that? This community houses 1/3 of the largest diesel bus fleet in the country, and that has really exacerbated the asthma epidemic here. And so air pollution has been one of the key issues, and a lot of our research has focused on looking at air pollution and trying to understand why we are having those environmental exposures, and then how we can address it. So we have, through our partnership, we have trained over 200 residents in a 6-week environmental health research and training program, training them around children's environmental health, lead poisoning prevention, air quality, indoor air allergens, and training them to work with their peers to take this information back to their churches and to their tenant associations and block associations to really spread this information. And then we now have a cadre of informed residents who we can mobilize. And so we've mobilized them to develop stronger lead poisoning prevention legislation at the City Council. New York City now has the strongest lead poisoning prevention law in the country. We've worked to reach out to housing and tenant groups to train some of them on the indoor air quality triggers, because we really have to develop collaborations with maybe untraditional allies in order to really mobilize residents around these issues. So our organization has had a commitment to combining research with action to really create change. And we realize that policymakers need that mobilization, and they also need the credibility of the research and the research institutions that we work with. So what kinds of findings have we had over the years that have really made an impact? Well, we've been working with Columbia on a cohort of 720 mothers and newborns. The mothers wore backpack air monitors during pregnancy, and at delivery, cord blood was taken so that we understand the sensitivity of the newborns. And then those children have been followed for the past 12 years or 11 years with developmental tests at key points. And so we found a number of things. Very high prenatal exposure to PAHs in diesel soot. So diesel soot has a number of components and chemicals, fine particles, and those particles are very easy to breathe into your lungs, but are very, very hard to expel. So what have we found? We know that 1/3 of the cohort of children have developmental delays, genetic alteration, and low birth weight due to the impact of diesel just walking around in this community. We know that the spray pesticides that people use in their apartments for roaches or other pests that exposure has led to developmental delays and low birth weight. And so how have we worked to take those findings and translate them? So for the past 18 years, we've had a campaign against the Metropolitan Transit Authority that runs the buses. And we've been able to use that research with our partners coming to press conferences, helping us testify at City Hall, being on government work groups to look at these issues. And we have now been able to transform the largest bus fleet in the country with a diesel retrofit on every single bus. Now, we just worked on the depots here in northern Manhattan, but that means that every bus citywide has that new policy. So a diesel retrofit, investments in natural gas and alternative fuel buses. That's one way we've used that research. Another way is looking at the pesticide issues. We found in the early stages of the research that certain chemicals, chlorpyrifos and diazinon, that were chemicals in spray pesticides, were being banned by the EPA, but they were banned halfway through our study. So in the latter part of the study, we were able to see the drop in exposure from those pesticides. Of course, you know, the chemical companies come up with new ones and new formulations, but we've tried to make sure and do surveys through CBPR, training residents to go into 99-cent stores to make sure that those products are now off the shelves. We've also been able to take that pesticide research and go to the City Council and ensure that now there is legislation around pesticide notification in schools. It used to be that pesticides would be applied in schools. Kids are sitting there with asthma, or teachers. Nobody knew this. Parents didn't know that. And I'm sure clinicians might wonder, well, why is the child, if they're taking their asthma medication or they're following certain protocols, what are those other environmental conditions they're being exposed to? And a lot of clinicians don't know these issues. And so getting stronger pesticide legislation was very important. We've also, a newer issue has been phthalates. And phthalates are chemicals in consumer products that we all use, lotions, perfumes, anything with a fragrance. We also see phthalates and other things like BPA that are in the linings of cans. And so we're all exposed to these issues. But now we're understanding that they're endocrine disruptors. And so we've been able to get a Harlem legislator to sponsor legislation to ban BPA in babies' products. So these chemicals, which are plasticizers that make plastic softer, were in babies' nipples, nipples for bottles, and other pacifiers, and other kinds of babies' toys. So those are now banned for use here in New York State. So having that community-based exposure research that's very place-based has been very, very valuable when you're trying to change policy in a given locality, state. And of course, some of these things are around federal regulations. So in order to really improve community environmental conditions, we really have to look at working at a local, state, and federal level. And we've got to have engaged, informed residents mobilized to talk to their elected officials and let them know the importance of these issues. So we have really learned that having strong partnerships can really improve environmental health and protection in our communities, and that we need the kinds of partners that are going to translate that research into real policy and action that improves lives. Thank you very much.
Well, that's to talk about a community coalition that does exist. So the East Harlem Community Health Committee, the coalition, it's been around for more than 30 years. It was born in critical times. It's had its ups and downs, always been consistently around for health issues in the community. But as crises come up, community coalitions get stronger. But it's long-lasting. Most of its work is done in subcommittees. It's a membership organization. It has providers and consumers, mostly providers, but within the subcommittee work, we get to the consumers. So the first question is, so tell us a little bit about how the coalition itself was involved in research. Not partnering with anybody, but just driving it. And so this is like an old man story because it goes back a little way. But I call this on the left-hand side down here the do it, own it model, where in fact it was research that was conducted and started. The research questions were asked, the results went back to, progress reports were made to the health committee. And publications was not an issue. So most of the early work in East Harlem on asthma was all done under this auspices. It was done, all the early work in diabetes, or the survey of all the providers in diabetes on standards of care, standards of practice, was done under the auspices of the health committee, not an academic medical center, not an individual researcher. The immunizations push, starting from terribly, appallingly low immunization rates, or going out into sites, and that was done under the auspices of the health committee. It was not done with paid researchers. How was it done? And more lately, emergency preparedness has been done under the auspices of the health committee. How was it done? Well, mostly by the sweat equity of the membership, partners that they could coalesce to help with them, either could be faculty members, could be students, could be other community providers, could be people from wherever. And a lot of work done by students, which I'd like to say is a very good source. At that point, they're pretty much unbiased. And I always, in this early work in asthma and diabetes and immunizations, we encourage them to say, just go in and say, I'm just a medical student, I don't know anything, but. And then after the but comes the zing question, you say. And we still do that today regarding referral networks in East Harlem. They go out and say, how come you can't get your results back to Barican Health Center, you say. So all of this work was in the do it, know it stuff was certainly done and done pretty well. And then I took a look and said, but what's the scene today? What's going on today? And I think over here, what I portray is that you've now got what I call the partnerships tension, which is how do community organizations relate to generally the academic partner. And so there's people in this room that know one hell of a lot more about this. They spend much more time at it. But I thought that some of the things that go on, for example, are typically one has to consider what type of research that is involved. So when it's clinical patient care research is one thing, population-based research is another, and health systems research, HSR, I would really put a plug for encouraging getting involved in health systems research or health services research, because then you get to community-wide issues, things like referrals and pathways and even immunization processes, which are very different types of research, and therefore the reason I bring it up is because it affects the dialogue that goes on in this tension between the researcher and the community organization. Knowing the academia policies, the publish or perish, and the role of the IRB in an institution. And I would argue, by the way, that the role of an institutional IRB is usually to protect the researcher and the institution. And there's lots of evidence, and I've started 2 or 3 IRBs where it very rarely loops back to making sure the patient was okay. It loops back to making sure the researcher and the institution were well protected. Some societal things one has to be aware of course, what's going on in industry, what's going on legally, and I would also make an editorial comment that the more recent trend to link industry with academia research is probably going to have an effect. You're going to have some big players coming into the scene about how to do research and some powerful ways to do it. And then, of course, the institution itself that you're dealing with and what their mission is, which does change, and what their emphasis is, which does change. So I said, well, and we seems like we have some, what I would say are very specific CABs, so community advisory boards around a specific project, a community advisory board about a specific subject. So you could have a project that gets a grant and immediately forms a community advisory board for that grant or for that project. And so this you can start to see lots of little individual ones which don't net worked out. So I wanted to ask the question of why did this transform to this? What happened? And what does it mean? And my conclusion was first of all, there was little interest in these subjects early on. Genuine little interest. And people got interested, and it, not unnaturally, a lot of that interest was to do with dollars. The dollars were put in the pot. And I think this changed the equation quite a bit. And certainly the East Harlem Health Committee, for example, we had one excursion where we accepted dollars to carry on with our research in asthma, and at the end of it, we said, we'll never do that again, that the dollars actually corrupted what was our main focus. So I think if you can accept the fact that when interest in dollars gets to a certain critical mass, you're going to go from anything like this to something much more like this, and this has got to be where we put our attention. If you accept that fact, one of the questions is there any good that comes out of this? And I would say that for front ends, for things which people don't have an interest in yet, don't have an awareness that it's a problem, and there isn't a lot of money thrown at it, this could still be a role done by a community coalition. When this was all new, and there are new things all day, Peggy mentioned several that were just not on anyone's menu, not on anyone's awareness level, and there's a certain amount of work that can be done with sweat equity, membership, partnerships. You're not doing the publish or perish. You're just trying to show there's a problem that's worthy of people getting interested and spending money on it. When that starts to happen, you're going to lose control of that, but so be it. That could be a genuinely good role, and say, pass it on, move it on. And now you've got to start to play a much tougher game over here. But over here, I still believe there's still room for that, and we would still do it today when you identify new issues and projects. The second thing that might come out of it is any caveats I would have about this. And I would say, whenever you're talking about tensions, and a lot of my students and people I mentor come up to me and they say, we've got to negotiate with somebody. And their version of negotiating is, you got to be tough, you got to get at them, and have a tussle, have a fight. And I say, no. True negotiators don't do that. True negotiators understand what the other guy's point of view is. And they understand it so well that they can come to an understanding. So you can't go in saying, I don't like this publish or perish nonsense. That's a fact, and you have to understand that. You have to understand some of these trends within. What's happening to medical students? All their time's being used up. Understand that. You can't fight everything that you don't like. But to have an understanding of if it's an adversarial, if it is, if you have an understanding of it, is the best negotiation of all. And I would really urge that people really have a genuine understanding of that. The third part I was to comment on was the relevance to the purpose of this meeting. And one of the purposes that I read was, how would there be such a thing as a New York City or a subset of New York City research advisory board or something like that? And so this is my issue here is, should and could, instead of starting over here and working out a new part of the pyramid to try and control, these will not go away. These individual community advisory boards for specific projects, I don't think will ever go away because it's so efficient and effective and people get interest. But where does this sort of general oversight, wisdom, helping people get started, stop them from falling between the cracks, which was a role that East Harlem Community Health Committee did back here. A new researcher would come into town and say, I can give you a jump start on what's the population, what's this, what the stated problems are. Doesn't mean there aren't any new ones. What the stated problems are, we can help you give a jump start. And if you have troubles about how do you form an IRB or a special CAB, we'll help you out. There's some role in here. And I think that one of the possibilities that you might consider in your deliberations, I'm done, in your deliberations is taking an organization or organizations which already have a broad-based, long-standing coalition strength in a community and converting that, if you will, into a role, one of their roles being to do this in research. As a start from the inside of the research and then working out and saying now we have to build a structure above it. So that's one of the things that one might consider, and whether that could be a continuous role and where does that broad-based coalition come from? Because some of these organizations that are created, they come and go, others stay for a long time, but it seems to me. So in summary, yes, this is a fact, this was done. I think this was a model that worked for front ends of things, and then you've got to be prepared to hang it on. hand it on to other people. And then you're into the negotiating, partnering, discussing. But I still think there's something sort of missing here. And this will be what it will be. And smart people will learn a lot about everybody that's in that relationship.
And I'm honored to be the chair of a group called the Harlem Community and Academic Partnership, HCAP. I'm going to say a little bit about who we are in a minute. And today I just wanted to talk about, share with you a few things. Can you see this? Is this feels like if I had a way to turn the lights down a bit, I would. I just want to talk about a few things, which is, I'm sure my mouse is working right here. I want to be able, at the end, for you all to know, be able to define what community-based participatory research is. And I want to talk throughout my presentation, share examples of how it's been applied to our partnership, HCAP, and then thread also throughout all of that my perspective on CBPR. And one of the ways to talk about CBPR is to tell you what it's not. So, and I really would like you guys to just ask questions along the way, and there are things I'll ask you along the way as well, and we'll just take it from there. I will be saying CBPR instead of community-based participatory research, so you just know for shorthand that's what I'll be referring to. And HCAP will be the Harlem Community and Academic Partnership. If there's anything else that I say, stop me, and I'll be happy to explain. Okay, these slides will be available to everyone post the summit. So, because everybody who registered, we have access to your email. So, and CCPH is very good about getting information back out to people. So, no worries in terms of the information. I want to start with a few definitions because often people are like, what do you mean by community? And what do you mean by community partner? And also, what do you mean by research partner? So before we talk about these definitions, who in this room has been involved in a research experience with an academic institution? So you either participate on a community advisory board or you are part of a research team? A couple? Okay. Who has not? Yes. Is this sign in? Oh, okay. Sign in. Who has not had an experience working with an academic institution on research? Has not had. Okay. Okay. Good. Who? And you're thinking about it, right? Okay. Good. So there. What I wanted us to sort of support one another and share experiences, but also questions about like, I don't know anything about this, so what happens when this happens, or should I be aware of this, and so forth. So hopefully I will trigger that along the way. Now, community-based participatory research traditionally has involved a partnership approach between a community component and an academic component. And just to sort of ground ourselves, I offer this as a definition. I don't, there's a lot more ways to describe community partner, but this comes from a manual that was developed for doing community-based research with assisted living facilities, actually. So the source is here, and then if you want to look at it later, I'd be happy to get that to you. But the definition states that a community partner is a stakeholder. Now, it could be an individual, right? Community leaders, community residents, or it could be organizations such as broad as like a community health center or groups like coalitions and so forth. Right? They have a commitment and vision for a CBPR project who brings relevant knowledge and expertise. And it's not limited by geographic boundaries. So obviously, there are different ways you can define community by common experiences, conditions, and so forth. So I just want us to sort of have that definition on one end of the spectrum. The research partner is often an individual who's traditionally trained, right? The folks who have the PhDs, the MDs, who have a background, the technical expertise of the systematic investigation of new knowledge. So when people say, well, how do you define research? Research is the systematic investigation of new knowledge. So they are trained in the methods to produce new knowledge. Okay? That's the sort of plain language way to say it. And there are different kinds of researchers. There are the basic scientists, right, the ones who work in the labs. There are the clinical researchers who work in clinical healthcare delivery settings. There are community-based researchers who work in partnership with communities or work in communities, and we'll get into that in a minute. And then there are folks who are really just see themselves doing secondary data analysis, right? They look at big data sets and they just sort of crunch numbers and they generate, papers about, well, we know on a population perspective what is going on with regards to XYZ condition. So I just want to have those two definitions floating in the air as we get further into this topic.
Do you have printouts
Yeah.
of this slide?
I do not. They will be emailed to everyone afterwards. Absolutely. So there are three things that I want you to remember about CBPR. First of all, this is an approach to research. CBPR is an approach to the research process, okay? It is not research. It's just an approach. And I'll graphically show that to you in a minute. The first thing I want you to remember about CBPR is that it is exactly this, a collaborative approach to research. And I would add, ultimately, policy analysis and advocacy, because what I said before, translational, research to policy and practice, okay? The approach to that experience should go all the way from figuring out what your research questions are to using that research to inform policy and practice, all right? That equitably involves all partners. So I suggested earlier there's traditionally a community and a research partner in every stage of the research process. Now, those of you who have been involved in research or either currently in a CBPR project or in the past may have been involved in ways like, they just want us to go recruit. Like just find people for focus groups or find people to fill out a survey. That is not CBPR. If that's all you've been involved in, that is not CBPR. I'm talking about every single step of the research process. So what does that mean? Graphically, this thing, doesn't look as clear as I want it to. All right, this is the most important graphic that if you have in your back pocket, you will be okay with understanding what CBPR is and isn't. I want you to take for a minute, consider the truth that research happens, the whole research process happens in 6 steps. First, you identify the health concern, right? The issue is, and I'll take an example from our partnership, re-entry, right? Folks in our, actually I'll switch because that's more of a policy focus that we've taken. Immunizations for hard-to-reach populations. That's an issue. We've identified it. Okay. Then you design a study and you seek out funding. Then you recruit participants, right? And you build retention systems and you implement them, right? So we gotta get subjects into our study, whether they're families, individuals, so forth, and we gotta recruit them and keep them in the study. Then we've got to develop the measurement instruments and design the actual tools, right? We've got to design the surveys, we've got to design the moderator's guide, we've got to design the protocol, and then we got to collect the data. So then we got to ask them to survey. We got to collect the data from the survey, we got to collect the data from the focus groups, and then we have to figure out what does that data inform? Oh, an intervention, something you're going to do. You design the intervention and you implement it. Okay, we're going to do a health education seminar series because what we learned from the data is going to help us design a health education seminar series or whatever. And then you want to see if that intervention had an impact. So then you analyze the data, you interpret it, you have findings that then get disseminated. That is the basic research process. Basic. I want you to consider there are multiple approaches to the research process. CBPR is one of those approaches. Another approach is the traditional research approach. So the traditional research approach are these set of arrows. And I'm sorry this is not as clear as I want it to be. Maybe with the lights, I don't know how to control the lights. The traditional researcher, right, the folks who are trained in our academic institutions, are trained to approach the research process in the following way. If the first step is to identify health concern, issues are identified based on epidemiologic data and funding priorities, right? So they'll go to the data. Well, the data says this. Therefore, we must study this. Okay? They will approach the study design, usually it's entirely based on scientific rigor and feasibility. Funding requested primarily for research expenses, right? So they would design a study totally based on, well, this is the gold standard. This is how we do clinical trials, and this is how we do qualitative research methods and so forth, and it's rigorous because what's the end goal? To publish in peer-reviewed journals, all right? So the traditional researcher will approach the research process in this way. CBPR would take a different approach. CBPR says, wait a minute, we think data is important, but we actually think full participation of community in identifying the issues of greatest importance increases motivation to participate in the research process. Does that make sense? Can you see the difference in the approach? Right? How many times you've been at meetings where they say, well, the data shows this, and you think to yourself, well, one, how did they get that? Who they ask? And two, that's not really an issue. Right? Like, that's not an issue. So why are they investing millions of dollars in this? Okay, so this is the approach I'm talking about, CBPR. As you walk through the research process, so now you say, okay, we've identified this issue because despite what the data says, it's actually affecting this population more than ever, i.e. maybe Latinas and pre-dementia, right? Either the data doesn't exist, or what people think is important to look at in terms of data is not, because the community says, no, we got to shift the focus here. The next step would be that the community representatives involved with the study design and proposal submission increases the acceptability of the study approach and includes funds for community. So think about it. If you are able to have a say in what's going to be investigated, right, there is a higher level of interest and acceptability involved in executing the research process. So the study designs are going to be meaningful, they're going to be rich, they're going to be very specific to your community focus, whatever that is. Then you move along to the next box. Community representatives provide guidance regarding recruitment and retention strategies, enhanced recruitment and retention. Well, we did a study on trying to identify and enumerate hard-to-reach populations, right? How do you find it? If there was a bioterrorist attack, how would we immunize and vaccinate hard-to-reach populations? And so our CBPR approach, when it came to this step, we were like, well, we know where they are. The academics didn't know where they are. We know. We know exactly how to find folks who are unstably housed. We know exactly where to find them when, because they go to the programs, but they also go over here because we're primary connectors. So we understand what's going on. So that recruitment method becomes very, very robust, right? And it becomes very specific. And then you move along to measurement instruments that are developed with community input and tested in similar populations. This allows for potentially sensitive issues handled better and increased reliability and validity of measurement. How many times have you read like survey questions and you read a question, it's just like, one, I didn't understand the question. Like the readability, like, what are they asking? Or questions that are asked in a very offensive way. Offensive, right? Or insensitive way. And so if we're involved from the beginning with our research questions, you can see how by the time we develop a survey, it's going to be a match. And we are very good about, when we designed, and I'll share this a little later, but we did some focus groups about folks asking public housing residents about how they feel about folks coming out of jail. And we knew we couldn't ask the question, are you formerly incarcerated? Because we were involved from the beginning. We knew we couldn't ask that. And a traditional research approach might go right into like, not even have any concern. So, and ask a question is very private, right? Or may trigger things, and it's just like, folks will close off. I don't want to participate in this study. I'm done. Get me out of here. All right, so then the next step happens, and community members help guide the intervention development, assures greater and cultural, social relevance to the population served, increasing the likelihood of producing what? Positive change. CVPR is about causing social change, social positive change. So you can see that if you're involved in the intervention design, it is going to be familiar, and again, sort of your own acceptability ability being involved in the research process. Now, if you're disseminating community-wide intervention and you're a part of it, I trust him. He's a part of it? Okay. I'm willing to participate in this seminar series. I'm willing to participate in this trainer. I'm willing to whatever the intervention might be. And then finally, community members assist with work with researchers with interpretation, dissemination, and translation of findings. Assures greater sensitivity to cultural and social norms, climate, and potential group harm, and enhances potential for translation of findings into practice. So can you see that if you're involved in the study in designing the research question from the beginning, how you would want to make sure that everything you learned goes back to those who are most impacted by the issue? Right? I'll never forget, and I'll call it Little Sisters. Little Sisters The Assumption is a member of HCAT. And I'll never forget a colleague from Little Sisters said, I'm not in this for the sake of science. What? I'm not in this for the sake of science. I'm in this for the sake of action. So we do all this, and we learn something new. But what? And so the approach to the research process that is community-based allows this to be very, very powerful. Let me tell you something. There are a lot of terms out there: community-based, community-oriented, community-placed, community-centered, community-focused. All right? You have to know what it is and what it isn't. Community-based means that community is the chief ingredient. That without it, it's a wrap. Community-oriented is not community-based. Community-oriented is exactly that. It's oriented to community, but doesn't mean, right, that is the most sufficient, necessary component. So you have to be mindful that when people particularly research, I'm a CVPR researcher and we do CVPR, do they really? Do they really? Based on this approach? So think about the collaborators that you're in now, or who you might want to collaborate with, and see, am I in the driver's seat? Am I really in the driver's seat? All right. The second thing I want you to get is that this combines action and advocacy within the research process. As quick as you come up with the research question, there's always a policy question. There's always a policy question. And in fact, oftentimes, because of poor policy, it triggers a research question, right? Like, what do we want to know more about? Well, we know that there are particular policies that make it very hard for women who are of a certain demographic to access housing. So we are interested in learning more about their health status. And what is it that we can provide as an agency? That might be your research question. You want to characterize the health status of a certain group of women. But there's also a policy question, which is what? Housing. What are the policy issues surrounding your research question? And that, I'm telling you, is where the community partner side of this partnership, that's what you bring to the table. You have to hold the partnership accountable for action and advocacy, okay? You have to, because if you don't, it's called, and if this sounds a little vulgar, forgive me, but in the end, it's just intellectual masturbation. Think about it. That's all it is. And who benefits in the end? The peer-reviewed journals. So, the third thing I want you to get is that CVPR, using that approach to CVPR, cultivates and create a cohort of community activist researchers. Those of you that are part of current CABs, part of projects right now, have to figure out a way to exploit it and be able to gain research skills so that you can take that back to your agency or your community and combine, become this hybrid of a community activist researcher. Because trust me, the traditionally trained researcher is not is scared of activism. They're scared. They're not trained to do that. They don't know how to wrap their head around it. And so, at the end of the day, in the face of no funding or no interest in your priorities, because that's just not sexy this time of day. At the end of the day, we need to have community activist researchers, and that begins with us in the room. Okay. So, CBPR. If you look in the literature, you have a question?
Yeah. Is the traditional researcher going to say that activism is a bias, that you already have an agenda, you already have a conclusion that you want to come to? That's going to taint the research. I mean, do you ever hear that?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and a lot of what research is about is having intellectual control. Control over the products, and so they often are thinking from the literature that doesn't add anything to the literature what your agenda is. You want to cause this policy change? Well, that's not what the literature is about. And that's a good flag. Be like, well, you know what? We don't have to work together, right? And I'll show you sort of things to look for when about the researcher and yourself or other community agencies they might be working with about them coming to this, determining whether or not CBPR is a good fit, a good approach for you. So some of the early work of community-based participatory research was published at University of Michigan, and there's a key article by Israel, and we can provide, that's all on the CCPH website, but they identify key principles that guide the CBPR process. So that whole process I outlined for you is guided by, common sense principles, right? Equal participation, it's cyclical and iterative, which is often a problem for traditional research, because they're like, they see themselves very linear. Disseminating findings even in non-traditional settings and so forth. So the principles behind the approach are pretty obvious and make sense, particularly from a community standpoint. So what do you think is the rationale of using CBPR? I just outlined the process and the approach to you. It's fair. Everybody benefits. What would you tell a research institution? Be like, you know what? We want to research this, but we want to use the CBPR approach, and this is why. This is the rationale. What are you going to say? It's fair. Fair is everybody benefits. Yeah.
Because these are the problems we're seeing on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
These are the health impacts that we can.
Right.
The data collected is going to be more robust.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You're going to be better informed, and you're going to come to more valid conclusions.
Right.
That have a stronger basis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The quality and the validity of the research becomes much more real and improved. Yes.
You have a team that is experienced.
Exactly. Involves communities that have been marginalized, largely involves communities. You don't see a lot of CBPR kind of oriented projects happening in the Upper East Side.
And it wouldn't be partial, like a lot of these researches, these studies are partial to one group. I mean, you're dealing with the whole community, so it would be more inclusive.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So these are just other bullets for rationale for you to have in your back pocket, okay? Because it's an experience that allows those who are most impacted to be a part of the process of not only investigating it, but designing solutions once we figure out what we've learned. Okay? Now, let me tell you about HCAP. We are a diverse partnership of community residents, community-based organizational representatives, individuals that represent public health institutions and academic institutions. We were originally started as an urban research center. The CDC back in the early 90s wanted to figure out what works in improving the health of urban populations. David Satcher, who was, I think, the first black director of the CDC, said, urban health is something we need to focus on. And so they started the Urban Research Center program. They established 3 of them. The first one was in Detroit, and it was housed at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And their whole focus was trying to examine social determinants of health, right? You guys know what I mean by social determinants of health? What are the factors in a neighborhood, at a neighborhood level, or in a community, that add or detract from health, right? So they were interested in figuring out, their whole focus was on chronic conditions. Then they funded the second one in Seattle. And the one in Seattle was housed at the King County Department of Health. So they're a county department of health, not an academic institution. And their whole focus was looking at things like domestic violence and so forth. New York City Urban Research Center got funded in 1999, and we were housed at the New York Academy of Medicine. Okay, so sort of a private nonprofit think tank. And we were housed in a center called the Center for Urban Epidemiologic Studies. So I'm going to call that CUES, because that's what that stands for. And our whole focus was examining social determinants of substance use. Why is it easier to get drugs than get healthy drugs? Right? And so our roots were looking at all the things that were connected to a substance-using population, infectious disease, how people convert from IDU to from a non-IDU to an IDU, and so forth. And so the members of the group were largely drug treatment providers, aid service organizations, multi-service agencies, and so forth. And each urban research center had to use the CBPR approach to the research process and create a CBPR research portfolio. Okay? And we were dealing with Detroit and Seattle were very much focused, had to deal with a lot around race issues because Detroit, you guys know, one of the most segregated cities in the world, was dealing a lot with black-white issues, where Seattle was dealing with much more complex racial ethnic issues of recent immigrant groups from Southeast Asia, from Africa, and so forth. And so it wasn't black-white, it was tribal, it was, it was deep, it was complex. And in New York, it was about socioeconomic issues, class issues, and we were like, we don't get it, we're black and brown, we get it. It's bigger than that right now. This is about resources. And so we all had different ways of addressing what works to improve the health of urban populations. There's a long history of HCAP. We've been around since '99. We are no longer with the New York Academy of Medicine. We have departed ways, and we are no longer funded by the CDC. We are becoming an independent research policy institute, and I could tell you all about what it means to figure out how to keep a partnership together, but that is being addressed in another workshop. But if you'd like a one-on-one conversation about that, I'd be happy to share. I want you to just sort of get a sense of how we're organized. We come together on a monthly basis, the second Tuesday of every month from 12 to 2. We've been doing that for 13 years. I guess that's 12 years, 13 years. And we are folks that are academic research trained. We are community activists, community leaders, that both from East and Central Harlem. And we have no funder, and folks are there wearing their hat as a community partner, as a research partner, okay? And how we get the work done are through working groups called intervention work groups. These intervention work groups come about with no funding. They come about out of a strong interest of what? Greatest concern. These are the issues of greatest concern. And what we do is we try to create small pilot studies to generate proposals for funding and get ourselves funded, okay? And we create interventions, which leads to outcomes and products and dissemination that lead back into new ideas, new focus, new efforts. And I'll share a little bit about our products. I think I have my next slide. So we recently created a purpose statement, and I just wanted to share that with you because it was our first exercise recently to draft this. But we believe that we exist for the purpose to provide information about social determinants of health in underserved communities to community-based organizations, academia, public health practitioners, and policymakers to promote community-centered good health and well-being for all residents. This is our first cut at our purpose statement. We've received legal support from Community Law Office, Legal Aid Society, and so we have to, you have to go through all these processes, right, to become an independent organization. So even after 12 years, we still had to think about, well, what's our purpose? We feel it in our gut, but to have to articulate it and write it down was an exercise for us. Because you have to know, we went through 2 reinventions. The CDC pulled funding with 6 months notice, and they said, oh, we're ending the Urban Research Center program. Sorry, you got 6 months notice. And that was about 8 years ago, and we reinvented ourselves and so forth. So it's been quite an exercise. Our mission statement is the following. We recently worked this out as well. We're committed to obviously identifying social determinants of health, which I explained before, and advocating for public health initiatives where the community is at the center of it all, and implementing community-based interventions to improve health and well-being using a CBPR approach. So we hold ourselves to that approach. That's the only way we'll do it. That is the only way we'll do anything that has to do with research. We want to influence health policy formulation implementation. We made sure that was part of our mission because we said, we've been around for such a long time. We've done all these amazing things. We want to make sure that that research serves as a platform to inform policy and practice, right? Because we don't want it just floating in the air and doesn't do anything. So we're holding ourselves to that in our mission. And then, of course, facilitate community academic partnerships for research and policy. And that happens a variety of different ways. One of the things we realize is that exactly why this forum is happening is because there's a lot of small CBOs out there that are being tapped on the shoulder by academic institutions like, come work with us, or we're really interested in your population, or you got good data. Yes?
So you implement your findings, maybe that you founded need some type of research for you to create some data, and you use academic partners to do the research for your group?
We work with academic partners to do the research, yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. You don't do it on your own.
We do it on our own as well, yes.
Well, that's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
How do you do it on your own?
Because some of us, in terms of we don't have the PhDs, but we've been involved in this work for so long that we built the capacity to conduct our own research projects.
Focus groups.
Yeah, so I'll show you right now. We have, so let me just talk you through a little bit of our products. So one of our first intervention work groups was the policy work group. We established a policy work group. Why? Because the type of researcher we're working with are epidemiologists, urban social epidemiologists. They're very good at understanding, right, social determinants of disease patterns and trends. But we're not good at translating those findings into policy and practice. And one of the things we established was the policy work group. And that was led by Sister Mary, who some of you may know, who is an advocate in domestic violence, an Irish Catholic nun, who's been in Harlem for over 50 years, and Sister Tahira, who was an African-American Muslim Republican, faith-based organizational leader in Harlem. And together, we established a policy work group, and we had with us a policy-trained person, Cassandra Ritas, who some of you may know, and we did a lot of work around reentry. We wanted to figure out what would it take for successful reentry of formerly incarcerated individuals. Why? Because East and Central Harlem was one of 2 zip codes highly represented in the population that was incarcerated in Rikers Island and prisons, right? So we wanted to understand, man, and our communities have such high recidivism rates. What is getting in the way? What are the barriers?
Getting in the way of them
coming home.
Independent.
What were the issues what were the policy barriers that were getting in the way of successful reintegration into the community? And so Cassandra Rita started, out of our early work, developed what's called a guide to policy for community-based research CBPR practitioners. And this is a policy analysis and advocacy cycle that she created based on the work she did with us. And this has become highly used across the country. If you're going to the CCPH conference, she'll have a special session, but we've had her come multiple times to do workshops solely for community-based organizations and leaders to understand what it takes, how to do policy analysis and advocacy, okay? So a lot of what Peggy Shepard shared, the We Act example, is actually used as an example in some of her work. So we also created the survival guide, and the survival guide was published about 10 years ago almost, and it was designed to be a resource guide for substance users and their families. And it was totally designed by the community partners and the academic partners, part of HCAP. We did art workshops. We hired, we interviewed. Like, this is what I mean, every aspect of the process. This was our intervention. based on a bunch of surveys we did with drug treatment providers, we said, you know what? It's clear that folks need a resource guide of some kind. That's what we learned, so let's create it. We did not want it looking like a government brochure. We did not want it looking like something nobody would pick up. So we hired a Latino HIV educator / graphic artist, and he held workshops, art workshops with drug users and substance users that we had access to through other studies that we're doing, and they created an artwork for the guide. And so I have one copy here, and all of the content was written in plain language by both community members and academic members of the partnership. And just this little story, this is intended to be a self-portrait of one of the art workshop participants. And so this caught the eye of the AIDS Institute for the New York State Department of Health. And they go, oh, we love that guy. Can you make a statewide version? This was
Resources, it's a guide for resources.
It's a guide for research, how to write a resume. What happens if you get an infection and a cyst and a pus from injecting, how to clean that, things like that. Sorry, I didn't say much more about the concept, but that's what's in there. And then the state approached us and they said, well, we want a guide for folks transitioning out of prison. So we created the transition guide. One time after 27,000 were printed, they were supposed to go to the parole offices in a black folder with HIV prevention, AIDS and prevention education materials, and a condom. So we said, okay, we'll keep an eye out in the neighborhood to see if we see them, with folks coming back and so forth. We hadn't seen them, actually, I think I can count on my hand the number of times since this has been printed that folks in the neighborhood have seen these guides. The New York State Department of Health. So I'll pass this around. And I want to make it very clear that they did not want harm reduction language in there. They wanted abstinence to be in there. And we wrote a letter to them and said, we'll do it, per our agreement, but we just want to write you a letter and say we disagree in philosophy with that. So then we decided that we needed some sort of a web-based, this was our work that we did when ESAP, everybody familiar with ESAP? The Expanded Syringe Access Program? Okay, so we did some work with ESAP and trying to get providers, particularly pharmacies on board with ESAP and not creating a space of judgment and being a roadblock. Our Harlem Resource Guide, which isn't functioning right now because we left the New York Academy of Medicine, is a web-based resource guide of the survival guide. And we're actually right now looking to identify another, especially I guess an academic partner right now because we need the capacity of a technology. We don't have the capacity to do that. And then Project Viva is a project that was funded by multiple federal funds sources. It stands for Venue Intensive Vaccination for All. And that goes to how do you vaccinate hard-to-reach populations? Like if things go down, we already know that vulnerable minority populations are not well protected when disasters happen. We're not. We're the first to get hit and we're the last to reconstruct. So what's going to happen when we need to immunize people? And so we came up with a way to figure out the methodology for doing that. So that's on projectviva.org. Our policy work group published our first policy report that just examined reentry barriers in East and Central Harlem. And then we had the Faces of Urban Health conference here, which was to really bring folks locally and across the country to talk about CBPR. It actually was held in this room. This is our most recent policy work group report. This is our study that we did, qualitative study focus group. That's our study design. But the approach to the study design was what CBPR is all about. Okay? So Sister Mary is the PI. This is an IRB approved study. Our recruitment is that we went to NYCHA buildings in Upper Manhattan. We did it. Sister Mary was out there. I was out there. It was family day. We were out there. We were like, we want to have a conversation about reentry. Call us. We had the focus groups at an agency. It was an unfunded study. We pulled money out of our pocket to buy cheese and crackers and water and soda. And we paid MetroCards and $20. And we had 5 focus groups that were held. And I encourage you to check this report out. I have 2 copies here. Pass around. We're currently in the dissemination phase. We've been going to community board meetings, meeting with elected officials, And we're having a community forum about this on March 30th. And I can send more information to you guys as well, and so on. So that's HCAP in a nutshell. So now I wanted to share, are there any questions so far?
Where you located?
We are housed at an agency called SCAN, Supported Children's Advocacy Network. But our fiscal conduit is the Human Services Consortium of East Harlem, which is also housed at SCAN.
Where is that?
345 East 102nd Street. Our website, I thought I put the website slide up here, but I'll read it later, is hcapnyc.org. And you can learn all about us there as well. Yes, sir.
Do y'all have like community outreach workers that actually go out in the community and, explain to the people exactly the purpose, why you're actually, showing them exactly the statistics of the community and what needs to be done and how to go about, looking for more information.
So we do not have funding to support community outreach workers. We are literally transitioning into an independent organization. So we have a very small pot of money, a couple thousand. Yes. Oh, the list was going around, sorry. So we, yes. Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know if this is the right place to ask later.
Go ahead.
So, the community partners can be individuals, groups, and so on. So I guess, it seems like to negotiate or to work with a organized, academic folks, it's good to be organized yourself. And community, I've seen and been in partnerships with an individual, and it's like overwhelmingly, the power difference
Yeah.
is unbelievable.
Yeah.
So I guess that's one of the questions I have about individuals. And again, this may not be right.
No, it's all works because this is sort of what I want to get at with things that I think you should be aware of about CBPR that isn't always understood in the academic world. And I think there are other aspects about CBPR that aren't acknowledged or recognized. And I think it's really important that you guys just, hear it at least once, and then you can decide for yourselves how you choose to use that information. You have to be really aware of how researchers talk about CBPR. And there are plenty of researchers out there who say they do CBPR and they're not. And I'll be honest with you, these CTSAs, not all of them are doing CBPR. But let me tell you, when I was on the NIH Council of Public Representatives, I made it very clear at a meeting because I personally was approached by at least 4 of the CTSAs to help them figure out their community engagement core before they put the application in. Because they didn't have anybody on staff or any kind of experience on how to do community engagement. So those funded seats, those multi-million-dollar CTSAs, got that money because of grantsmanship, not because they had true community engagement experience. Okay, I'm telling you that's the truth. So you got to be really aware of what CBPR, of how they're talking about it. I've explained to you just a way to look at the approach. And that is where you have to come up with a set of questions and say, so tell me what you think CBPR is. Tell me an example of a project. How was the community involved? And if you don't hear they were involved in the formulation of the research question, in my mind, that's a red flag. Yes.
Do you have any examples of CBPR projects where the community that you were working with was not the community leaders, or like just regular Joe who works, I don't know, McDonald's, whatever, and because I think when we're talking about community, we're often talking about the people with the most power in the community. So do you have any examples where you were working with people, or other people were working with people who were less empowered?
Yeah, our policy work group, Sister Mary is unaffiliated. She self-identifies as a community resident activist.
But she's still in the place, and she's an activist,
Right.
she's organized, she's connected.
Right.
Is there examples of working with people, just, someone who's not an activist?
You mean an organization?
somebody who's not involved whatsoever, like trying to get people, just regular people, involved in the research process.
Are you talking about her organization working with?
No, she's talking about just someone, not off the street, but someone who's not necessarily connected to anything, but
Working
like
with your organization?
working in a research collaboration.
I think that if you do,
Go ahead.
I mean, we do a lot of work, I'm authorizing for urban health affiliation with downstate and the community part of the campus party center. And I mean, I think your question is a good one, but I think sometimes there are different roles in the community to play. People who have leadership, who you have to acknowledge that leadership is earned, respected, and therefore you have to play that. Not always that they substituted the common voices. Some of them represent those common voices. It's better than each other. But, and the other, sometimes, some not, and everybody, that's not specific.
Yeah.
Right? In academia, everybody represents academia also, and there's some who are more power now. Right? So the second aspect of that is community organization, and we do a lot of work with your staff salon and barbershops.
Oh, good.
We do a lot of work in churches, communities. And we have people who initially didn't understand their role as community health providers or promoters that now are actively involved. But that's a process. And that process you work with people who are so-called trained, how we engage people, teach them, from our knowledge of the limits they have with academia.
Right.
Which I think is a good point you made. You have to have research activists who engage in social justice within the system. Because if not, you know, the people who come in get socialized the same racist, ethnic, cultural biases that the institution has. Right? And very typical, they say, oh, we want to do it, but when you have to do it, then the big question comes. I'll give you a good one. When you talk about you have a multilingual community like Brooklyn or Queens, and you want to do a survey, they always say there's not enough money to do it multilingually, like they want to do it in English. Well, if you go to the Haitian community and you don't speak Creole or French, and you don't understand the culture, because they're not only languages, this is a combination of even to them, you miss a whole lot of things.
Right.
So I think
The community CBPR is about a collaborative process of where you have both partners. In this case, we're just isolating to community and academic because there are other kinds of partners that can be involved, that are involved in every aspect of the research process. So then you think to yourself, okay, have I been involved in every aspect of the research process? Now, as much as it's involved with research, because that's the main idea, the main focus, there's also a policy aspect to this. And this is oftentimes does not get recognized or acknowledged the same way from academia than it does in community. Oftentimes, community representatives involved in CBPR partnerships are in it, not for the sake of science, but for the sake of change and action and advocacy. And so one of the take-home messages from today is that as much as you are interested in thinking about research and the research questions, there are policy questions that need to be asked at the same time. And we'll revisit that in a minute. So everybody comes together to this experience equally as possible, fairly as possible, to bring together each other's strengths and talents and expertise. Now that's in an ideal world, right? We all exist in relationships, and there's always a give and take, and there's always different kinds of balances. But as they say in sort of your personal sort of development world, literature, your communication is key, right? And it is so true when it comes to engaging in research partnerships that choose to apply the CBPR approach. So now let me tell you exactly what CBPR looks like. I want you to accept for the moment that the research process happens in 6 steps. Okay? The first step, now research is the systematic investigation of new knowledge. That's what research is. Okay? So we're going to systematically investigate new knowledge. We're concerned about, like was shared today, pre-dementia and Latinas. The first step is to health concern is identified. If that is the issue, that's been identified. The next step would be study design and funding is sought. Funding doesn't always have to be attached, because I'll share examples from HCAP where we've done things with no funding. So now you're going to design a study to answer that question. You then are going to you're going to figure out who is going to be a part of that study. Participants are recruited, and retention systems are implemented, right? You then are going to figure out what your measurement instruments are. You're going to design those and collect the data. So we're going to do focus groups, or we're going to do surveys. We got to design the tool, and then we got to administer it. Then you're going to design your intervention and implement it. Okay? And it could be, oh, we're doing educational seminar series. We're going to give out material, see what happens. We're going to do something and see what happens. You design the intervention. Then you're going to analyze your data based on the intervention and interpret it, find it, disseminate it, and transcribe or translate it. Let's just imagine that's how research goes. For the most part, we would say that's how it goes. Now, like I said, CBPR is the approach to this process. Academic institutions there are many approaches to research. Academic institutions are largely focused on traditional approaches to research. Well, what does that mean, Angel? How would you approach these 6 boxes to using a traditional research approach? So this bottom set of arrows delineate a traditional research approach to the research process. So a traditional researcher would say, well, in the first step of identifying a health concern, I will identify issues actually based on epidemiologic data and funding priorities. That's a traditional research approach to the first step. Then they would apply, the second step would be, they would design their study based entirely on scientific rigor and feasibility. Okay? Funding is requested primarily for research expenses. Then they would move to how they're going to recruit people. Approaches of recruitment and retention are based on scientific issues, best guesses regarding research community members, and keeping them involved in the study, and so forth. And it goes all the way to the last step, where research report findings from statistical analyses in peer-reviewed journals. That's a very common experience. Many communities, particularly vulnerable minority communities, experience with research. Come in, do your thing, be out. Right? The CBPR approach says, well, you know what? This is what we're interested in. In identifying the health condition, it's not that data doesn't matter, but actually full participation of community in identifying issues of greatest importance increase motivation to participate in the research process. Think for yourself of the research that you're involved in or considering being involved in. Have you had a say in what the research question is? Have you had a say in defining the research, the issue? Even in the face of data. Well, you know what? We're interested in looking at pre-dementia in another population, and the data shows that this is the most. It's just that's where we got to focus. And in your community, you may say, well, you know what? That's great, but that's not a priority in our community. The priority is actually this particular population. We want to characterize, the health status of unstably housed women who are largely Latina, who might be experiencing pre-dementia. So the research question is, what is the health status or health profile of unstably housed Latina women, for example? From a CBPR approach, and this is where I challenge you guys even more, because this is not exactly always written in the literature about CBPR, is as much as that's your research question, what might be a policy question attached to that? If you're interested in examining and characterizing the health profile of unstably housed Latino women, what might be some policy issues you would want to think about? Right. So what? You characterize the profile of unstably housed women, right? And you want to try to understand what might be the source of their profile in terms of poor health. It's probably policy related. Well, what does that mean? Well, maybe we have to deal with the issues of access to affordable housing. In East Harlem, there is a tremendous amount of housing. It's just not affordable. There are vacant condominium buildings in East Harlem. There is warehousing happening in public housing buildings and apartments that are being warehoused. So it's not, those are policy issues that have to be addressed at the same time. The researcher is not thinking about that, right? The researcher is not going to be thinking about that. We did a lot of surveys. We were trying to understand what service providers and we're engaging with how we wanted to better understand how what the social determinants, and I'll explain that in a minute, of substance use. You know, why was it easier for why was it easier to get drugs and get help for drugs in the neighborhood? We wanted to better understand that. But in order to really understand that, we had to deal with the issues of reentry. So we started asking the policy questions: what are the barriers to successful reintegration of formerly incarcerated folks? Knowing that our substance-using population are largely formerly incarcerated, they recidivate, and all these other things that happen to them. So you have to think, as much as there are research questions you may have, there are policy questions. You have to bring that to the table, to the experience of the partnership. The CBPR approach would say then, okay, we've identified the issue. You've had a say in what's going to be focused on. Study design is next. Community representatives involved in study design and proposal submission increases acceptability of the study approach. How many of you have been involved in actually writing the proposal that got funded? To some degree. Now, this is where easily the control gets slippery, right? It gets slippery because the community partner side may not necessarily have the research, right, capacity to understand the components of a grant, what it takes to write the grant, and all of that. Where the research partner side, we're like, well, we don't really know the community nuances, we'll just spin it in some kind of way. And then what gets funded is something that was totally different. Yeah, we didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about focusing on, women who are kind of, sort of unstably housed. We said women with this particular criteria. No. Say again?
And essential support.
Well, the problem is that you have to be involved in the submission. And so part of that is involved in the packaging of the grant. These are nuances in a partnership that have to be addressed right up front. And we're going to get to that a little bit later. The next step is that community representatives provide guidance regarding recruitment and retention strategies. Oftentimes, community-based organizations are approached to help be recruiters. Oh, well, we'll hit your staff off, your outreach workers off with a stipend if they can help us find unstably housed women so they can be a part of the study. Right? And that's exactly where your only participation is in the research process. That is not CBPR. And they call it a CBPR project. That's not CBPR, guys. Okay? You are not in it from the beginning. It is all phases of the research process. And so when you're involved from the beginning, you can have some say. I'm like, you know what? We actually know how to recruit unstably housed women. We know where they go. We know where they go at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesdays, because this is what happens. They mostly go to these set of programs. We know the program hours, and then they go, hang out at this other spot, and then they go over here, and some of them go pick up their kids from over here. We know where they are. The researchers are not going to know that. And so your recruitment strategies become very tailored. Measurement instruments are developed with community input and tested in similar populations. Potentially sensitive issues are handled better and increase reliability and validity of measures. How many times have you seen surveys that have questions that make no sense? You're going to ask people this question? Like the readability of the question, or they're offensive, insensitive? You can't ask women, that question about their sexual activity in that way. You can't ask that. What are you, crazy? You know the kind of women that we have in this community? They're from these different walks of life, this faith background. You can't ask Muslim women that question. So, if you're in it from the beginning, all the way through, you can see how you can influence the design of survey tools and measurements. Okay? You're in it all the way through the intervention. Community members help guide the intervention. Development ensures greater cultural and social relevance to the population served, increasing the likelihood of productive, positive change. So if you were in it to design intervention, you know what the advantage is if you're in it at the point of design of the intervention is that you have a sense of the readiness of the community to deal with that intervention. How many times are programs funded to do intervention and they fail? They often fail because the community isn't ready to take on that intervention. And so the value of what you bring to the table is a very unique, specialized set of knowledge and knowingness that says we can't design an intervention that's expected to do this, this, and this. That doesn't make any sense. The community's not ready for that. So you've made it this far in the approach. Now it's data analysis and dissemination. Community members assist with researchers' interpretation, dissemination, translation of findings, assures greater sensitivity to cultural and social norms and climate, and potential group harm, and enhance potential translation of findings into practice. What does that sound like? That the findings don't end up in just a peer-reviewed journal article. That is not just there. Your endpoint is bigger than that. Your endpoint is that that meeting happens at the basement of the community church so that people understand this is what we got out of the study, guys. This is what we learned about unstably housed women. They're actually dealing with this issue, and this is very much connected to how social services are delivered in this community. So we want to have a community dialogue about these findings and what's next. Now, traditional research doesn't prioritize any of that. It's very different. So you have to ask yourself, if I'm going to engage in this research collaboration, are they buying into the CVPR approach to the research process? And if so, find out how much has been done. Like, well, what step are you at already? Oh, we're designing the intervention, and now we're going to call it a community-based project. Oh, really? So who was involved in the beginning? Oh, well, we looked at the data, and we thought it was really important to address this issue. Or, XYZ funder wanted to really figure out innovative community-wide intervention strategies to deal with blah, 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 blah. So, that is how it's laid out. If anything you take away from this presentation is to know the difference between traditional research approach to the CVPR approach, okay? The second thing I want to make sure you guys remember about CVPR is that it combines action and advocacy. And you can see that as you approach, right? You can see that in the approach to the process, because without question, all that comes up in terms of every aspect of that process is like the policy questions that come up, the nuances of the community, the other issues that are connected to the specific question that you may have. I can't imagine all the other things that might come up with the focus on pre-dementia Latinas. There's a lot that's going to come up. And then I think finally is that I think CVPR is a pathway, is a way to create community activist researchers. And I say that because traditionally trained researchers are afraid of being activists. They're not rewarded. Their performance products are publications and grants. So there's no reward structure. Plus, they're not very good at translating their findings into policy and practice. And I believe a community activist researcher often gets, so I feel like a number of the members of the partnership that I'm with are community activist researchers. I self-identify as a community activist researcher whose roots are obviously in community advocacy and community activism, and learning how, the skills and the methods and gaining the technical skill set to conduct research.
So that would be
a hybrid.
Of the community,
Not yes,
in the community,
that's one way.
But definitely an advocate, activist type person.
Absolutely.
Who then learns how to do the research.
That's one way, or it could be the researcher who is very clear about what their technical skill set is and has no fear around, taking their findings and translating it to policy and practice in partnership with communities and using it as a tool for advocacy. Absolutely, you can go both ways. But it's this hybrid. So, yeah. Sure.
I want to raise a difficult question about the community partner side of the equation as to how do you ensure that the community partner is actually represented, not just thinking it's represented, because what could develop as in some cases, a bunch of highly trained professionals in academia working with highly trained professionals in the community
I think that's a common trap in community academic partnerships, and I think it's all about the design of the partnership. And I think you have to address in the governance and in the execution of the partnership that it has that balance. You know, one of the bylaws that we have in our partnership is that it's always 2/3 community representation, and we define community as very broadly: individuals, residents, to organizations, and that membership has to be, you know, demonstrated a certain way. How many meetings you attend, and your involvement in other aspects of the partnership. And then there is a sense of getting to know someone during that period. At least in the partnership we're in, we happen to know there's a lot of deep community, there's a lot of knowledge about who's the kind of community-based organization that really knows their community well and who they're serving versus those who act like they are and they aren't. So it's a very common trap, and what happens oftentimes is that academia will find CBOs, and they're very good at keeping them in their pocket and using them to be like, we're the voice of the community, you should work with us on our board, and unfortunately they're being pimped, basically. So it's a very common trap. And the whole point of this is asking very straightforward questions, you know. There have been individual agencies that have been interested in working with us, and we're like, you know what? We're not really interested in working with you because, you know, our experience of your organization has been not a good fit for what we're interested in. It's a challenge. It's a challenge, and this is, you know, obviously in theory how it's supposed to go. There are so many nuances, and you know, we're a partnership that's been around for 13 years, so there's a lot that we've been through, especially with that, and I'll say a little more. So in the literature, when CBPR sort of started hitting the public health literature, you know, it's grounded in various principles. These principles obviously make sense, right? That it's fair, it's equitable, they're involved in all phases of the research, and you have to keep in your mind that this is the guidepost. You know, what are the principles of involvement for you as an agency if you're going to be involved in a research partnership? Well, in order for my agency to be a part of this research partnership, we have to make sure that we're co-learning along the entire way. That if we're going to do a qualitative study, that we're learning what qualitative methods are. And we will teach you, we will educate you about unstably housed women. And there are a variety of ways we could do that. So these are just examples of principles, key principles of CBPR. I want you to think for yourself, well, could I map these principles back onto my research collaborative that I'm involved in now? Maybe, a little bit, kind of, sort of. Yeah?
So I am a computer research associate tied to that grant that I was talking about earlier this morning. So, and I'm also a patient and a member of the community. So I'm the glue between the academic organization, the community itself, and the community health center. And I'm finding that our social ecological framework is, I guess, their way of saying, okay, we're doing community engagement or community participatory. But actually, what they're finding out from us, especially from me, I'm like, no, wait a minute. If we're not in from the moment of the research question, let's not do this. As an example, we had a researcher who one day, a few years back, sat down in one of our waiting areas and started surveying. Next thing you know, we ended up being the main site on their grant. And now we have this infrastructure. They want to call this community-based participatory research, and then they want to use our staff to recruit. So I didn't have to meet with them. You already met me. So her personality, you see my neck, I'm the foil. And we sat there and said, no, you have to be able to recruit those times, to be able to see those patients at a time, because they're home watching their novenas. It's 3 o'clock, so what are you going to do? Some of them can't get back here. You're going to have to figure out how to do this without impacting them seeing the doctor here, because you're going to see the doctor.
Right. And,
You know us.
and I'm surprised if I was in your shoes, you know, and thinking about that research who came in, I mean, I would have been much more aggressive to say, not even carry on and be like, you're banned. You're banned from this agency and you are never to do that again. And we would write a letter to your institution and put the word out to the community. That's what you do. Because let me tell you something. This is community-based participatory research. It is, you have the power the whole time. And what academia needs is data. That is the currency in academia. And if you're going to engage in these partnerships, there are a lot of questions that need to be asked. Where is the data going to be housed? The data cannot leave our agency. You must bring your data analyst to our agency. We will find a hole for them to sit in, and a chair and a desk, and that is where the data analysis happens. And on top of that, your data analyst has to teach somebody from our staff how to do data analysis. All coding must happen here. All discussions about data must happen here. Or we need a program evaluator if we're going to go in on this together, because we need to evaluate our services and our programs so that we can strengthen our service funding portfolio and go for more funding. So, you know, you can't be nice about this, guys. That process is not about being nice. It is about being very straightforward and being very direct and saying, we were not a part of the design of this intervention, of this recruitment approach, of the question. It all begins with the question. Yes?
I was wondering, how prevalent is CPR in the curriculum of health programs?
It depends.
Is it more like an elective?
It's taught in a very passive way. You know, HCAP, we have our own social work intern, and you know, we just threw her in it and be like, all right, this is how it goes. You're gonna learn from us in the moment. You know, we gave her background, we gave her articles, but we're like, this is how it goes. And so I think teaching CBPR is really about being a part of the partnership and seeing the live experience, having the live experience, the lived experience of it. Because it's all about power, trust, communication. And data, and in academia, you're dealing with intellectual property, okay, that gets expressed in a product called articles in academia. And what we're pushing is that shift to other kinds of products, and that the intellectual property is shared. And that is hard.
So it seems like it would be really important to institutionalize that in health programs. Because in my social work school, we didn't learn this at all. We learned the very traditional
Absolutely.
research model.
Absolutely. And part of the problem is that academic institutions do not promote and advance investigators who choose to do CBPR. It's not rewarded. It's not seen as a valid attribute and reason for advancement promotion. So they get stifled and they're limited. And then you don't have community partners who are seasoned in this work serving as faculty to teach the course or co-teach it or create the opportunities. And when academia wants to work with community partners to do this, they often engage them in a very aggressive, harsh way, and it's exploiting. It's not like the leadership of the agency gets any sort of benefits being associated with the academic institution. It's not like they're often in faculty appointments or access to the library, or a stipend to precept the student. I see you. Yes.
No, I just wanted to thank you for that point, because I'm in Hunter's MPH program now, and this semester I'm taking a course called Community Organizing and Community Building for Health. And we're required to study CBPR. And in fact, Peggy Shepard is sometimes going to get speakers from my course. I heard it last night. But I think the question I'm going to go back and ask my professor, very progressive.
Is that Lynn Roberts?
Yeah, is this a requirement in the program as a whole, or is this your personal initiative because you are progressive and you understand?
I think it's very much her personal.
Yeah, I think it's her personal. Yeah.
But I think maybe, it's time to advocate for it.
Mm-hmm. Right. I did my master's at University of Michigan, my master's of public health, and I was in health management policy, but I was very interested in community-based public health, And I had to fight to be placed in a community health center to get that exposure. They wanted, they were very much interested in putting you in different, government settings and consulting settings and stuff like that. And I had to go over to the behavioral health education department and act like I was one of the students in that department in order to get exposure. And so my first exposure to CBPR was under the tutelage of a community partner in Southwest Detroit, who was trying to hold the ground representing Latinos in Southwest Detroit. And he taught me all about territory pimps. And he said, let me tell you something, academia, they're pimps. We all are, we got, and in communities, we all got our own territory. I got Southwest Detroit, representing the Mexican community, largely Mexican, largely predominantly Latino, and Northeast Detroit, Black, and then you got academia, and it's all about a hustle. There is a hustle to academia. There's a hustle to the grant writing world. You have to understand that there is this thing called grantsmanship. Okay, when I talked earlier about the CTSAs, 4 of those 6 CTSAs contacted me personally to advise them and give consultation on how to write their community engagement section of their grant and what they should do. What does that tell you? They have no capacity to do community engagement. But you know what? They got funded. Multi-million-dollar funding awards. And so when those folks who say, yeah, go with the CTSAs, I would use caution. Because they got away with it with grantsmanship. And that's why Elmer and I gave them a lot of hell at the NIH and say, you got 10% of the CTSAs that are funded in this country in one metropolitan area. And we can tell you for a fact that 4 of them have no clue how to do community engagement. So my tax money is going to fund that. There is an avalanche of research coming down the pike, and it's heading straight for vulnerable minority communities, and it's called CTSAs. So if you're going to be approached by a CTSA, you got to ask the right questions, okay? Because they've got a lot of money underneath their belt, and they'll pay you $5,000 to be a full partner in the partnership, okay? Now, obviously, we started talking about the rationale, but I just want to hear your thoughts. Like, why do you think is, let's say I'm an academic institution, I approach you and I say, okay, we want to work, I would love to work with you on this research idea we have, and you say, well, you know what? We want to take on a CBPR approach to this research idea. And I would ask you, well, why? What's the rationale for that? What are you going to tell me?
That was the only reason why I had applied for the position, was because the way I hope that this grant is going to end with all these other collaborations, and I'm making a point to end that way, is that it goes to the whatever information that's gained from these studies, that it comes back to the patients. So what you were talking about at the end of it, that you're sitting at the basement of some church about this what came out of the study, I want for that, for example, for the postpartum study, we ended up changing dramatically what the researcher wanted to do because it was just not going to work out. First of all, that whole indirect stuff, I don't know who said it, it's negotiable.
It is
negotiable. You really have to, it's like pulling teeth out of a barracuda, whatever fish has the most teeth.
Yeah.
But regardless, whatever it is, but it got crazy and we ended up getting more money because we needed it for operational costs. But for me, I know that whatever comes out of it, those postpartum women in that community understand this is what we learned from you, and this is why we need to continue to do this. I want those assessment tools to stay in the
So your rationale is closing the loop, right?
And that whatever is learned, whatever tools are validated, that they stay with us.
Okay.
Don't just give it and give it to the Vanessa's Community Health Center.
Right. I mean, think about the process we just walked through. What's the rationale behind that?
I think that, it's really easy to kind of exploit people. I might not use that word exploit, because that would make researchers very defensive, but
So what? Let me just stop you right here. You can't be nice.
Yeah.
You can't be nice. You have to be very straightforward. You have to be straightforward.
So either straightforward or in other
Yeah.
ways also asking people to open up their lives to you as researchers
Right. So those are most impacted by the problem should be involved in the design of research and the solutions, right?
And especially when there's money involved, someone's making money.
That's
Why
right.
should people, there's this whole industry of making money off of social
Mhm.
ills and still not
Mhm.
doing anything for this stuff.
So you have to come up for yourself as an agency, and some of you may have to go back to your agency and discuss with leadership. Like, where do we stand with research? If we get approached by Mount Sinai or Columbia tomorrow, what are we going to say? What if they just want us to be involved as recruiters? What are we going to say? Are we going to take a stance that anytime we do research, it has to be a CBPR approach? What's the rationale? And these are just some bullet points that you might want to use if you're in a conversation with a potential researcher, right? It improves the quality and validity of the research by engaging local knowledge. Local theory. You know, in East Harlem, there is, you know, it's funny because I'm finishing my doctorate, and I really struggled in my doctorate program because of the fact that the academic exercise of having to ground everything in a theoretical framework was frustrating, because I had 13 years of working in East Harlem of like, our theory is just do it. We don't think about, you know, what goes in this and what goes out that and how to explain. We don't think about that in that way. And so, you know, I like this idea of local theory because it doesn't necessarily have to be what an academic might be used to thinking around theory. Theory is really just, you know, is just a way of explaining a phenomenon, right? So the theories can be predictive. You can explain things with theories. You can predict things with theories. You can, you know, do a bunch of things. Obviously, involving communities that have been marginalized. Oftentimes, you see the CBPR approach being used on issues that are affecting vulnerable minority populations, marginalized populations. I have yet to experience or hear about a project that uses the CBPR approach in the Upper East Side. Right? And then, obviously, at the end of the day, those who are most impacted by these issues should be a part of the design of the solution. Okay? So, I just want to say a little bit more about HCAP. We are a diverse partnership of community residents, community-based organizational leaders, public health representatives, and representatives from academia. We started as an urban research center that was funded by the CDC many, many years ago in '99. The CDC was interested in figuring out what works in improving the health of urban populations. So they decided to fund a urban research center program. The first one was at Detroit. It was housed at the School of Public Health, University of Michigan. That's where I got my exposure. The second was in Seattle, and that was housed in King County Public Health Department, in their traditional public health department. And then the third was housed at the New York Academy of Medicine, which is a private nonprofit think do tank. And it was particularly housed in a center called the Center for Urban Epidemiologic Studies. And I'll refer to that as CUES. So all of the URCs were charged with a couple of things. First, they had to take on examining social determinants of health. What do I mean by social determinants of health? So think of it as like, what are the factors, right, in a community or the lowest level that add or detract from health? So it could be anything, right? Racism, culture, money, political will, socioeconomic status, environment, absolutely. Our job as URCs were to examine the social determinants of health with a particular focus. We focus on substance use. Why is it easier to get drugs than get help for drugs? What causes folks who are non-IDUs to convert to IDUs, injection drug users? What would it take for drug users to go into, to transition out of being, not become a drug user? What's the impact on families? What's going on? And community-wide impact. And so, all URCs were charged with using a CBPR approach to their research activities. So that's how we started. I will not go into our 13-year history because we've gone from everything from dealing with toxic investigators to CDC pulling funding, totally defunding us with 6 months' notice, to reinventing ourselves to the point where we are now, where we've left the New York Academy of Medicine. We are establishing ourselves as an independent community research and policy organization in East Harlem. And that uses the CPPR approach to all of our policy and research activities. That's where we are now. This is our loose structure where our partners, we all come together on a monthly basis, literally from 12 to 2 on a second Tuesday of every month, and we have done that for 13 years. We get the work done through what's called intervention work groups, and they are designed to have community academic shared leadership that focus on a particular issue of greatest concern. Remember when I said the CBPR process begins with identifying a health concern from a community perspective? All of our IWIGs start typically with no funding. No funding. Why? Because there was, for example, our policy work group, which is our oldest and first IWIG, started because Sister Mary, who some of you may know, an Irish Catholic nun who has been involved in domestic violence for many, many years, and Sister Tahira, who was a Black Muslim Republican faith-based organizer in Harlem, were involved in reentry work. And I'll say a little bit more about that IWIG in a minute. And together, the IWIGs come up with interventions and outcomes and products and position ourselves to go for funding proposals so that we pilot, so that we fund ourselves and take on sort of mini bubbles of CBPR. And of course, dissemination happens in a variety of ways. Yes, we've published. But yes, we've been at City Council providing testimony. Yes, we've been we've held community forums. Yes, we've been in the basement of churches. We've done it all. And all that circulates back into creating new ideas, new interventions, building upon other interventions, pre-existing work, and so forth. So your partnership could be designed totally different. All of those individuals that are part of this, who are representing a community hat or an academic hat, we ask, if you're going to be a part of our membership, how do you self-identify? Who's your affiliation? And can you be here wearing your HCAP hat and not your Mount Sinai hat or your Columbia hat? If you're a researcher, can you be a part of this organization and be the researcher, the HCAP researcher, and not the Columbia researcher? So we're not a traditional sort of one community-based organization and one academic partner. That's not how we are designed. But there are many partnerships designed that way. We're actually very much sort of a coalition, if you will, that's focused on research, that has the expertise to do community and academic engagement. Absolutely. That's right. Nobody, we have no primary funder. We get to do what we want, and we're asking people to be a part of this. First of all, I've never been paid as chair. The community partners have never been paid to be part of this the past 13 years. How we are supported is if we're able to get IWIGs funded and you bill yourself in as a consultant, and that the academic consultant gets paid the same amount of money as the community consultant. Okay? So that's how monetarily, but we chose to not pay ourselves because money messes up things. Other partnerships will pay themselves. There are many community advisory boards, which I'll get into. We named ourselves very quickly when we became funded as a New York Urban Research Center Community Advisory Board. We changed our name to the Community Action Board because advisory is not action all the time, right? When you ask somebody for advice, you can take it or leave it. That doesn't mean you're driving it. So that's generally what we look like. We just started this purpose statement. I just wanted to share it. We were able to receive legal support from Legal Aid Society, Community Law Office, to support us in establishing ourselves as a 501c3, and it was great that we have now as a pro bono resource, and it was great that they were making themselves, that we were able to get that because I think they learned a lot about us because we're not the traditional sort of organization that's providing a direct service. Like, what do you guys do? Like, we really had to be very clear. And I have to say that this exercise of crafting a purpose statement we've never done before. Even after 13 years, it's like, what's our purpose? Yeah, we've been through a lot. And so this is what we've drafted so far. We actually got to meet with Legal Aid to see if it meets sort of the IRS kind of criteria. This is our mission statement that we recently revised when we left the New York Academy of Medicine, which was a year ago. We wanted to make sure that we were holding ourselves accountable to advocacy, to influencing policy, to implementing, community-based interventions, using a CBPR approach, and then more importantly, that we were very committed to figuring out ways to reduce the vulnerability of community partners when they decide to go engage in research collaborations. Because all too often, many agencies were getting seduced by the money or getting, manipulated, like, be a part of this advisory board. You have a lot to say about diabetes. And then before you know it, you're burnt out. And what'd you get out of it? You got no money for your agency. You got all these patients and clients being surveyed to death, and you find yourself at 1,000,001 meetings. But what'd you get out of it? So a lot of what we try to do is talk to a lot of agencies in the neighborhood and say, hey, we'll be your coach. We'll be your coach. So, and I go back and I say that later in terms of strategy. So obviously this is, we're committed to this side of the approach to research. So let me tell you a little bit about some of our products. One of the first things we created was the policy work group. And the policy work group totally focuses on reentry. What are the ways in which successful reintegration of formerly incarcerated folks can happen in East and Central Harlem? What drove that is because Sister Mary and Sister Tahira said, what's happening on the street level is that women are struggling figuring out how to re-enter once they're formerly incarcerated because they were incarcerated because they were defending themselves and they killed their batterer. And that was Sister Mary's standpoint, her concern about women successfully reintegrating. And Sister Tahira said, who unfortunately, may she rest in peace, passed away, her son was incarcerated, and she happened to work for discharge planning in the Department of Health and Transitional Services. And she was able to speak at length of practice-based experience of poor transition, right, from Rikers into the community. And so we started trying to understand this more. And out of that work came this advocacy, the cycle on policy analysis and advocacy. Our policy work group was made up of Sister Mary and Sister Hira, and we had with us a woman who was trained in policy analysis and public policy. She had a master's from Harvard and was based at Hunter, and we had them involved in our policy work group. And she created a toolkit for CBPR practitioners on how to engage in a policy analysis and advocacy process. And so all of this work was because she was working with us in our HCAP policy work group. And so I would encourage you to visit it. CCPH actually took her on as a fellow, and this was the product. Her name is Cassandra Ritas. She's very good, and this is the cycle that she created based on working with us on reentry work. The survival guide is a resource that we developed very quickly early on in our partnership, which was to try to get real, useful, practical information to substance users and their families. And I have an example copy here. And how we approached it is that we knew we needed a small need to fit in the back pocket, like a pint of scotch, which I like, but it needed to have plain language. It needed to have information that they could use, like what does a resume look like? Or if you're injecting and you get an infection and you have a pussy cyst, how to clean that, right? Or what happens when you have certain medical information. But then we also didn't want it to look like a government brochure, very boring. And so what we did was we hired an HIV educator who happened to be Latino and a graphic artist, and he held art workshops with substance users. And so all the artwork became part of the guide. And we did one printing that was about 8 years ago, but it caught the eye of the AIDS Institute, Department of Health. And they said, well, we love that survival guide. It's very city focused. Can you create one for the state? I'm like, wow, that's going to be a lot of work. So let's go for it. So we created the transition guide. The transition guide is not as exciting in terms of artwork because we were dealing with a government agency. And on top of that, they didn't want harm reduction language in there because they're all about the ABCs and accidents and all this other stuff. And we said, we're not happy with the limitations you're putting on us. So we'll go through with it because we think it's important that this information gets out. But we also put out a letter to them, wrote a letter, and said, just so you know, in writing, we disagree with the limitations you put on us in developing this guide. So the AIDS Institute it was a one-time printing of 27,000 that went to parole offices, and they were supposed to be put in a black we translated this into Spanish, and again, part of our 13-year history is that we lost core funding and all this other stuff, so we were stopped because the funding to support these interventions became jeopardized. So we have it electronically, yes. But a lot of information is outdated because it's 10 years old. We also were involved in the ESAP, Expanded Syringe Access Program, which now you can purchase clean syringes from pharmacies without a prescription. And HCAP was involved in evaluating this before it became a law, and we conducted a multi-level intervention. And that was our first effort to really engage pharmacists as public health providers, because they often been overlooked in terms of being a linkage to treatment and referral. And people didn't really acknowledge the relationship that people have with their local pharmacies. And so we played a role in saying, you know what, we can actually, we happen to know a lot of pharmacies. And this goes into the whole design. This was an intervention we designed. As you can see, the artwork is very similar to some of the artwork that it's in the survival guide and so forth, the same graphic artist. And we designed a poster with him, and then we actually whipped out a map of Harlem. I'll never forget, Sister here, she goes, I go to this pharmacy here on 145th and 11th, and then I go to this pharmacy over here, and I know the pharmacy over here, have a lot of folks that go there because they have a really big selection of herbal oils and stuff like that. That is the whole beauty, right, of being involved in the design of a study. Because the whole focus was, if Sisters of Here was not part of this group, all the other future studies that built upon ESAP, which I'll talk about in a minute, wouldn't have had that really grassroots connection to local pharmacists, the non-Duane Reeds, the non-CVS, and so forth. And so we were able to engage them very quickly and easily because Sisters Tahira and others knew where the pharmacists were, the local pharmacists that people trusted. So ESAP was a success, and we played a role in making sure that ESAP actually became codified as law in New York. We also tried to establish a web-based resource guide, so taking the survival guide to the next level and making it a web-based. This website is active, but it's not up to date because it's housed at the New York Academy of Medicine right now, and we're trying to find another partner to help us hold it as a server so we can update the guide. But it is a searchable, it was intended to be like a FreshDirect/Match.com kind of thing, where agencies would own their own profile. You would have an administrator login, and you would go in and update your own profile. It wasn't our job to do that. Our job was to manage it, make sure it doesn't break, and evaluate it periodically. And then we expanded it to include, so you can see, you can access the resource, the survival guide here, and you will be able to do, searches, and it would print out a page. Now, how do we get this done? We got this done by engaging graduate students in information technology at NYU and said, we got a project for you. How about you help us create a resource guide, a web-based resource guide, and we want you to put yourselves in the shoes of a service provider. Imagine that you need to find for your client showers, food, and access to a particular kind of health service. How would you design it? What kind of programming would you need to do? And they sat there and they created the first web-based resource guide, which didn't look like this. It was a much more archaic kind of thing. And it was able to generate a profile that would allow you to see the hours of operation, how to get there, if there were bilingual services, and so forth. And so we brought on one of the students as a programmer when we had the funding to continue updating the guide. At this point, again, until we find a partner that can hold the sort of the technical aspect of it, but at one time it was a very active resource. So these are things that can be public goods, right? And this is all based because we did surveys with service providers, and they said, we're connected to the internet. We just can't find up-to-date resources. When we got to make referrals, the resource books, the binders that exist are like outdated, and it's all about who you know and what my Rolodex has at the moment. So we created a resource guide. Project Viva, when the CDC pulled funding, and they said that, I said, well, why are you pulling your funding? Oh, we're changing our funding priorities. Bioterrorism is the way to go. And that was obviously after 9/11. And so we said, well, who is going to vaccinate and immunize hard-to-reach populations? Well, I don't know. We didn't figure that out. Well, fund us to do it. And so Project Viva came about. You can go to projectviva.org. And VIVA stands for Venue Intensive Vaccinations for All. So we have Project Viva funded through a variety of different federal sources and increasingly foundation sources of funding. And Project Viva Harlem is just wrapping up. And that was allowing us to, and remember how I showed how the arrows whip back up? Well, Project Viva Harlem is a second phase of the Project Viva, which allows us to engage pharmacists and say, well, how can they play a role in helping to vaccinate and immunize hard-to-reach populations? Part of our effort was playing a role in the coalition that got formed with the lead of the Department of Health to first give the authority to pharmacists to immunize and vaccinate. And that recently was a law that passed, I think maybe 2 years ago. So we were a part of the letter writing campaign for that. And then Project Viva Harlem now uses many of the partners, pharmacies that we worked with in ESAP to be a part of a Project Viva focused in Harlem with pharmacists doing screenings and health education and really being linkages to treatment and referral. So my point is that you can layer on different approaches, as you get more and more involved in research, you start to see, well, what if we took the approach that we use at ESAP and combined it with this new approach, and why don't we start thinking about how we can layer on different research strategies? And then before you know it, you've created a whole new set of methodologies. So the whole argument from traditional research, oh, it's not scientific rigor. Wait a minute, we're creating something totally new that hasn't existed before. We're creating new measures, new ways to enumerate hard-to-reach populations. We don't have to be stuck in the box if the methods haven't been created. All right. The policy work group, we published our first report back in 2007, and this was based on, this was co-written, the power of students. We had a medical student and a social work student who helped us co-author this report, and it was really our first cut at examining barriers to reentry in East and Central Harlem. And so out of that report, we started focusing on housing. And before that, we had a conference here in October. We're actually in this space. Turo is a member of HCAP. And it was our way of sort of sharing what HCAP has been up to the past 10 years, but also hearing what else other community-based organizations were doing in research. This is our most recent report that we published late last year. And this is a study, an IRB-approved study of 5 focus groups. So like I said, the research process stayed the same. We used a qualitative study. The approach to it is what matters. This was led, PI, Sister Mary. Okay? The recruitment, we came up with the questions. We designed the moderator's guide. We designed a recruitment strategy. We wrote the IRB protocol. We submitted it to the IRB through our academic partner at the time, which was the New York Academy of Medicine. We then went and did the recruitment. And so this was a set of focus groups where we recruited public housing residents to understand their knowledge and perceptions about folks coming home as formerly incarcerated. Because between that report, this report, and the other report, a lot of the reentry advocacy was like, we got to use public housing as, that's the solution to provide housing to formerly incarcerated individuals. And I'll never forget this woman who attended one of our meetings, and she happened to be a public housing resident. She said, well, has anybody asked public housing residents how they feel about living next to folks who are formerly incarcerated? Like, is anybody gonna ask? And so that was the drive for this study. And so we went to NYCHA housing, between Sister Mary, myself, Sister Hira, Eric, others. We were out in the family day, because every NYCHA building has a family day. And you're out there, we had our recruitment flyers, and we had our own way of recruiting about getting folks to come and talk about reentry. And even in the moment of the recruitment encounter, folks were ready to talk. But that was because we came at it from a very, authentic perspective. And so we had 5 focus groups. We did one in Spanish. We moderated. We took the notes. We analyzed the data. We coded it. We wrote up the report. And we have it out in dissemination. And that is, we're not interested, our endpoint of dissemination is not a peer-reviewed journal article, it is this report. And the goal is to influence the current dialogue around reentry. And just quickly, the major findings have been public housing residents really had a selective tolerance. They were like, you know what, it all depends on the crime. It all depends on the crime. We're not interested in living next to pedophiles, sex offenders, rapists. There were about 30-something participants, about 40% of them as shared, they were fully incarcerated. And so, it all depends on the crime. There were very forgiving folks like, you know what, you did your time, you did your time, everybody deserves a second shot. Some felt, you know what, it depends on what your reputation was before you left. We don't want you back if you were not a good thing. So it really gave us some very good insight on what public housing residents, you know, a small number, we're not saying generalizable, but at least we were able to document the perspectives of public housing residents living in neighborhoods where there's a high recidivism rate and where a lot of folks are being released. So there are a couple things that I want to share that you guys just are aware of from my perspective, and I think often gets not talked about in the research collaboration that happens. So I just want to focus the next set of slides on that. I think it's very important for you to understand how researchers talk about CBPR. That word gets thrown around like, you know, like it's, you know, so commonly understood, and it's not. Many researchers are very good at saying, I do community-based research, I do community-based research, and they collapse the terms, and they call themselves CBPR practitioners, and meanwhile, they're working with an agency to do recruitment. Or they have a community advisory board, but they're just, the only way you see community involved in the process is as part of a community advisory board. Okay? If you consider the way I explained and illustrated the approach to research, you have to be very clear that if you're going to go into that research meeting and be like, you tell me what you think CBPR is. How do you define CBPR? To what extent is the community involved in this project? All right, you have to really understand the role of project managers and project directors. Oftentimes, CBPR projects are funded with a project manager, and they find themselves sort of caught in between the community and academic, sectors, part of the partnership. And my experience with project managers has been both positive and negative. The positive has been some have been able to really hold their ground and not be able to be manipulated by the PI, because sometimes the PI doesn't have the balls to be very straightforward about, you know, the way things are going because they feel they're losing control. They will make sure they will get the project manager to do it. And the project manager ends up having these sometimes awkward conversations with community partners and say, well, we're going to change direction, or we actually decided to delay the survey, or we're not ready yet, and they become the messenger of the PI. You also have to figure out how to we made sure that we interviewed every project manager that came on board with us. So having a role in interviewing and selecting the candidates is important. We wanted to make sure that we were particularly interested that we had minority project managers, people of color working for the partnership. We wanted to make sure that they had a background in some sort of community organizing, community service background. So there were things that were important to us. You have to also be aware of the funding climate. You know, this whole indirect rate. Is everyone kind of clear what that means, the indirect rate versus the direct rate? So it's very common. So every academic institution has what they call an indirect rate or overhead. And that is money that's used to pay for exactly right, the lights, the building, and so forth. How academic institution, and that is determined by percentage. Okay? So many academic institutions have an indirect rate that's about in the 60s. Some even as high as 75%. What does that mean? How do they determine that percentage? So what they do is what's called a space study. So academic institutions will do a space study. They will assess the physical space right, that their institution has a footprint on, and they will determine how much space is used to conduct research. That space, that square footage gets converted into some sort of formula that puts out a percentage. So the goal of academic institutions, right, is to increase the physical space to do research. That's right, because they were able to justify the need for that funding. So let's say we have a $100,000 grant, and I'm going to use XYZ University has an indirect rate of 69%. 69% of $100,000 goes straight to the university for indirect costs. And the direct cost is whatever's remaining, which is what? 31,000, I think?
No.
So that's why you have to read the grant guidance. The grant guidance will say, this is how much, some funders will cap the indirect rate, so you can't do more than 8%. Some funders will say, the grant is $100,000 in direct, indirect is in addition. So you may get the grant, it's $100,000 for direct expenses, and $69,000 on top of that for indirect. But that $69,000 is going to the university.
And that's what provided with this space.
Well, how do they get to the 69%? Because they do the space study. And the space study, right, is all the physical space they use to do research. And the federal government helps them figure that out. And then, boom, they come up with a 69%. So can you see there's an incentive to increase your physical space to do research, which translates to a higher percentage, which translates to higher indirect? So when there are new research buildings being built, that feeds into the space percentage. So you have to be aware of those things. So that 69%, oftentimes agencies don't go into the conversation with, let's negotiate that 69%. How about you take 33.3% and we take the other 33% and cut that 69% in half? Now, most academics are like, what? Now, the researchers themselves may be down for the formula. I would love to be able to do that, but I can't get away with that. Why? Because they're handcuffed. Why? Because the administration, the research administration at many academic institutions are putting pressure on academics to get as much grants in. Why? Because they benefit from the indirect.
So they get that indirect.
Yes. So NIH grants allow for the full indirect. There's 69%. HRSA grants, right? Grants that come from HRSA, another federal agency, are capped at 8% of the training grant. So you have to read the guidance. Some foundations will say we only pay up to 10% indirect. And that's why we asked for the budget. So you want to work together? Oh, it's already funded, this project? Let's see the budget. And then you got to figure out how to retrofit yourself back into the budget that's fair and equitable. Like, so what's the indirect rate on this grant? Oh, it's our indirect rate of 69.5%. 69, okay, so that means, do the math, you're getting $69,500. Yes. We gotta negotiate that, because you know what, I have indirect, I got staff. I have fringe benefits to pay for. How are we gonna share that? And that becomes a complicated conversation. But it's a conversation that needs to be had, because you cannot be taken advantage of when it comes to that. And that's why you have to be in it from the beginning. Right? Can you see how important it is to be a part of the submission of the proposal? Because at the end of the day, it's about money. Yeah.
It's such a broad topic, and I kind of want to see what people, I don't want to talk down to people and explain what IRB is and spend time that's necessary, but at the same time, I don't want to go over the head of people either. So maybe we should start with some introduction and talk about what your own interests or questions about IRB is, and then maybe we can have more of an organic discussion. I'll bring in the slides if I have to. I can always email you the slides too.
Deidre Gonzalez, and I work with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and Emergency Preparedness and Response. So I have an interest in terms of IRB, and
access because we're working on community resilience and trying to understand that. So of course, we're trying to conduct baseline studies and understanding how resilient all communities are. And we have our own internal community IOB process anyway. But I'm also here because I'm part of the Harlem Community and Academic Partnership with Dow. And I understand that you guys have a community institutional review board. And I imagine you've had conversations with Angela, you have mentioned that we are moving in that process, and we've been considering whether we should become a community IRB entity. So I'm really interested in finding out how you guys went about doing it, what was some of the process, some of the challenges, and like what we should be expecting, because I'll be reporting back to you in terms of this, and seeing if this is a model that we want to go after as we are. So this would be a good opportunity for us to see, we're really looking right now at which direction to go and what would be a good fit for us.
My name is Nancy, Nancy Shore. I do several different things. One of the things I do is work for Community Campus Partnership as a consultant in the disciplinary area of high school for a while, and some of their how the community processes work, and just interested to hear what you're going to cover today. I also serve on an IRB on an institution, so I have that experience. And that I also serve on a community basis.
You should also mention your article around
I think there might be on your seat the disc that you all got in the back. I think there's maybe on the disc there's an article that Serena did, and you are the study advisory group for that looks at different community groups across the state.
My name is Susan Gamber. I was responsible for the community based in Eastern Central Florida. And I don't know a lot about this stuff. And I thought this was probably
So, starting from basics. Yeah. And my name is Eric Wong, and I work in a nonprofit organization called Social Justice for Groups, which is based in LA, called SSG for short. We do a lot of direct services. We have different programs that serve pretty diverse populations in LA. Some of them are pretty vulnerable. People who are homeless, people with HIV, reentry folks, mental health consumers. And we also are very interested in doing research in the community, community-based research. More than 10 years ago, we were part of a cohort that was funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that really encouraged doing community-based research. And we have developed, not we, when I say we as SSG, I just speak for my time as SSG, but we really have a really good relationship with some of our academic partners. And who are really interested in developing capacity of the community to do research. So it's not just, it's not these horror stories that you sometimes hear of, academics coming into the community, getting the data and using it without really disseminating or sharing the data with the community. Right. So a lot of times it's really about, having more of an equitable relationship with the academic partners so that you, as community members have more say in terms of what kind of questions get asked in the research project, and also making them accountable to reporting back to the community once they have some data. So if you're involved in through that process, it's not just, data is it's a partnership. So you own the data too, so you get to do what you want to do with it. And if you decide to share with the community, you can do it in a way that makes sense and meaningful for you. Right? And there are academic topics who understand that process or that partnership, the importance of that partnership, and really want the collaboration. We're very lucky in that we have the partners that like that, and they understand the bureaucracy of a academic institution, including IRB, and I think it was Ray who said this in the panel, that we think sometimes these IRBs are meant to just protect the researchers and the research institutions, they're not really protecting the research participants. So this is a sentiment that was expressed in another meeting yesterday by someone else, IRB. Not every IRB is bad, but there's a tendency to think that ultimately, what gets you in trouble is someone gets hurt or even die in a research project. That's when all these things happen. So a law is trying to make sure that doesn't happen. Not only for the sake of the people who get hurt or people who die, but also sometimes they are looking out for their own interests because they're not getting sued or having a bad publicity. So there's all these kind of things that are going on. And we thought that we really needed. The other context is a lot of times universities are are much more adept in doing ethical review of biomedical research. Because that's all a lot of bread and butter. Community-based participatory research is sort of a newer concept in a lot of universities, and they might not have a way to, even if they have the will to be ethical with community-based participatory research, they might not have that same understanding as the university. A community-based research project. This is not an SSG example, but this is an example that I've heard. So there was a research project that involves working with youth as researchers to look at how available liquor is in the community. And it's very common to do this thing where the youth will go into the liquor store and try to buy liquor and see if a liquor store will sell that to you, right? I don't remember, but it's well, Central LA definitely has a lot of those issues. But I don't know if that happens necessarily in Central LA. But it's in California. This example is in California. So a typical IRB, or in this case, the institutional IRB thought that this is not ethical because it involves deception, and which is not feasible. You should not deceive the research participants, because a teenager going into a liquor store trying to buy liquor is seen as deception. But there's also a community benefits component to it, which is you want to find out how available liquor is to the community. So there's so they might have a different understanding of evaluating what the IRB does is sort of every research project has this. Every research project hopefully has benefits too, and most of them do, and almost all of them do. But the point is, with the IRB is you're trying to evaluate it, you're trying to minimize the risk, and you're trying to maximize the benefits. So in this case, there's conflict in terms of how a more conventional research perspective might look at deception versus a more community-based participatory research. So does that answer your question about example of community-based project?
I can give you an example. Yeah. It's something that we actually said we didn't have a conflict with the IRB board. So, HCAP, one of the things that we strive for is community engagement in the work that we do, and really getting community perspective, and we try to do research. And we're not funded, so it's the bare minimum. It's really the grassroots, true grassroots efforts that we do. So one of the areas that we are engaged in is policy around reentry. So we're looking at formerly incarcerated, returning to Harlem and the New York City area, and then we go to Culver Division, South Bronx, and Eastern Central Harlem. So about 3 years ago, we conducted a project where we held residents from NYCHA to understand their perspective of how they felt about people coming from jail or prison and returning to Harlem and the availability of housing. So a lot of the policies that are being made do not take in the resident perspective. Policies are made and they're saying, NYCHA decides we want X number of people here, we want the background to be like this, we want it to be like that, we want to exclude certain people, but it doesn't take into the perspective of the people that are directly impacted by it.
And juniors get released from prison and coming back to my building, I'm not comfortable with it because
But the thing is that NYCHA already has regulations that exclude certain people from returning, and there are people that are waived, that it's okay for them to return depending on the crime that they've committed in the past. And some of those crimes, when we spoke to the community to get their perspective, some of the crimes that are allowed to return back to housing are not things that necessarily people in housing would be comfortable with. But what we wanted to do in terms of an IRB process was to get community input directly from the affected population to inform policy. So when we presented it, because at that time we were at House at NIAM, we went through NIAM's IRB process. And their initial concern was more about us being open about what we intended to do with the information and if it would have any direct impact on the participants. So that was their concern that, if we collected identifying information and somehow this got back to NYCHA, that people were saying this or that, and that could have a negative repercussion. So what we did, we conducted a confidential study where we got the information of the people that were participating, but we didn't attach it to any comments that they made.
You could just mention one of the areas that RV will look at competence or confidential value or confidentiality. IRB, to go back to sort of the history of how this, this is very basic to there has been producing research, especially in community health, right? And the IRB is really a process, a mechanism that you use to evaluate whether or not a research project is ethical. So without IRB approval, a research project cannot go forward. So every institution, academic institution, but most academic institutions, hospitals or clinics who want to do research, or who want to do research with their clients, they have to make sure that they're protecting their subjects. So they have an IRB. So we use what we call an institutional-based IRB. And we develop community-based IRB, like I said, as a way to also empower our community partners. Because a lot of times they go through the institutional-based IRB, what happened is they didn't write the research application. They get these feedback, they have no idea why this year we have changed certain things. Right? And they didn't have a chance to explain why we designed the research project this way. Yeah, they get a letter. So we want to develop, and then maybe an academic partner sometimes, in some cases, will hide behind the IRB and say, we want to do it this way. So we want to have another process in community partner say, well, our community partner said we have to do it this way. This is a way to sort of make them more equal in terms of research partnership. So it's a more of a review process that's trying to involve the community, getting their input into thinking about how the research design could be better, could be more responsive, could be more useful to the community. And the community IRB is not the only mechanism to do that. I know we have been trying to figure out like more of a kind of a hybrid. There's a lot of community review research board that's more advisory. But if you have a good relationship with the institution, that seems to work really well. We just heard from yesterday's meeting with the University of Pittsburgh, that's a really interesting setup over there, and it seems like it's having a lot of impact. They're not an IRB in that, they're just advisory. You don't need approval to move forward with the research project. Organized from the access area, I think that she talked about some of the things that we asked was thinking about. on, no, this is necessary, everyone has to do this, right? So I think part of the conversation is when does it make sense? So that's, so we started the RLB in 2004. I came on board in 2003. And a lot of research has been done before I came on board. I mean, I was just basically handed like this folder and say, here, implement this. And what happened before I came on board was we have another person who also helped me with this presentation, her name is Jackie, and she did a lot of research around what models are out there, what kind of tools do they use in terms of the instruments, like what do they require for applications, what do they require for renewal, you know, if it's more than a year project, you know, and how do we get your permission from the Department of Health and Human Services, which has an Office of Human Research Protection, OHRP, Human Subject Research Protection, that recognizes RLPs. So we went through that process, and I have to say as someone who's running an RLP, there is not much monitoring by OHRP. You know, they have the power to audit you if they really want to, and you better make sure that, you know, all the minutes of the RLP meetings are there. They're very strict about quorum. Seriously, you know, it's one of those things that if someone needs to leave to go to the bathroom, let them know that they're coming. Kind of stuff, you know, so, but I don't know how much budget they have in terms of actually auditing people. There are a lot of IRBs out there. When you think about every university, almost every university has at least one. One with UCLA, they have 5. Multiply that nationwide. You know. Because they have so many research protocols that maybe one office is not able to handle all of them, and they have so many different kinds of restrictions that are necessary in an RLP that there might be one RLP that handles more biomedical type of research, and then one that handles more social, political, educational, or behavioral type of research.
Most people that want to publish in these companies, they need to have some sort of IRB process around it, peer reviewed, and it shows that the credibility of the work that they have done. So because of that, and then the different specialties that we have, like for us, it's like we have one IRB office, the Department of Health, and they pretty much oversee everything, the basic questionnaire, even if we're not doing it, or if we're not actually working with the people directly, we still need to send it to IRB, even if we're doing survey monthly. We still need to ask IRB if it's okay. And again, it's the concern that one, if you decide to publish it later on, but the other decide to do a later point, because if you want to make this, share this information later on, we need to have it backed up. And two, they really want to make sure that no one out there is going to come back and say, you know, the Department of Health asked a question, and then later on it was left at night, middle of the night, I couldn't sleep because you asked me about emergency preparedness. And so it really gets that to that level of like, we want to protect human subjects to the degree that, we want to like leave no stones unturned, and then it really sometimes gets way out of proportion.
Right. It's a lot of paperwork for, and when we design our process, we make sure that we minimize the paperwork. Because it's a lot of burden, especially for community-based organizations who are not used to doing this type of research. Right? And we also want to have more of a dialogue in terms of making review. So it's not like you give me a paperwork and then you hear from me in a month. We actually invited the partners to come to a meeting, and we only review one proposal. Throughout, an hour and a half meeting. Because we want to spend time really talking to the researchers about why they decided to do a certain way. We might throw out some ideas about how it could be better, more responsive, more useful. And then so that when people leave that room, they can actually kind of know what needs to be changed. And they understand why that was being asked of them. Instead of just getting a letter, a month later without any context. A change was for it. It's like, no, this is the word that we want to use in the community. That makes sense to the community. so we try to use the process as more community friendly. We also ask the community partner and the academic partner to come to the meeting. That is a requirement, really. So that we want to see what the partnership is, like how they interact. So we want to also elevate the role of the community partner in the research process, by making them come together. What's public? Exactly. So there are little things that we do that try to advocate for the community partner in this process. And the composition of the RLB, the OHRP, the DHHS folks who regulate the RLBs, there is a requirement that at least one of your members is a community member. Now, they don't really define what that community member is, or they call it a non-scientific member. Right? So on our IRB, we actually we have 9 people now, and all but 8 of them worked in the community. So a couple of them have PhDs, so they are very rigorous in terms of their research. We want to make sure that we do have that rigor. But the rest of them, they work. They might be coming. They'll cut their staff of CBOs. Like some of them are actually staff from the communities that they serve. They live in the community or they come from the community that they serve. Some of them might not even have a high school diploma, but they have the experience of doing community. All of them have the experience of doing community research. One of the newest members that we invited on board is a PhD student. But we've got actually brought certain kinds of expertise around nonprofit because that's what they were studying. That would be helpful. But otherwise, most of our members are actually community members, and we felt that was really important to have. So the way we structure it, and try to stack the cards in a certain way that help us in terms of fulfilling our own objectives. We started out with 9 members in 2004, and I asked a couple of them to step down because they were not coming to me. I was explaining this yesterday. One of the hardest job that I have was trying to make sure there's form, because without form, it's a waste of time. Especially with all the regulations and other properties. I'm like, we'll get someone else to complete this late. You can't do that. So when you have people who consistently do not show up, then it just, I just have to work hard to make sure other people show up. And, all of them are volunteers, all of them are full-time, they're really good at the time to do this. Yeah, so, and it's not something that I don't honestly give us a So we have 7 for a few years. And then I brought it up to 2 because I found a couple of people. Again, it's like LA is a huge place, and we do a lot of really diverse projects, a lot of vulnerable populations. So I kind of want to make sure we have that expertise. We only review about 3 to 4 projects a year, so it's not a big load. But I feel like this is what a volunteer IRB members can handle. I don't want to burn them out. They actually enjoy the process right now because it's a few times a year that when we come together, these are practitioners. So a lot of times when they ask the question, it's not because I know the answer, so I'm going to give you the right answer. But it's like, I'm asking the question because I don't know, because I deal with this in my research project. I have my way of dealing with it, but I want to learn how you think about this. So this is another way that we see the capacity building happening. No, they come to us. So right now we're limiting it to our open student partner programs and their partners. We also make it open to the IRB members and the organizations. So most of them are not affiliated with organizations, but have been partnered with us So aside from that, we really have to review other folks. And we get requests all the time, and there was some talk about how much we charge. Right now it's free. So how much we useful for you, but
Yeah, I
too much
know.
information, but that's fine.
Useful for me.
So I can tell you, while I was talking, the other person I want to talk to who is here is Maylin Isaac from Hawaii, who also has an RLD, who's now thinking about turning into a fee for service. And she's charging, she's thinking about charging $750. They have an arrangement with the university that doesn't have an RLD at the moment. That's what she told me. And then they want, and that university, every time they have they pay for an RLD review of a for profit, like one of those companies that do RLD reviews, they pay at least, let's say $7,000. You know, so she's doing it as a nonprofit. I think 750 is too low. That's okay. Because I think she's going to get like, I mean, we didn't have a chance to go really deep into it because I have all these questions like, well, you know, she has some community members too on the RLD. So I wonder if she's, I mean, we're not paying on members. I wonder if she's starting to pay the members because there's, yeah. Well, I think there is a lot of administration, and if you want to grow the RLD, you probably need the money to do that. It's probably go for the salary for people who more than RLD. But the number of the proposals that they're going to be using is a lot dramatically. I mean, it might be a small university, but even if, I don't think she would be doing that many either. Curious to see how that changes the but we saw we do a case-by-case basis. We've been entertaining inquiries, but we haven't seen the proposal and people have to comment. My philosophy right now is I don't think that we should make a profit if we're not doing the RLD numbers. And then the RLD members decided they should be paid just to but we can also change that. It's an ongoing conversation. We just worked out that way, you know? Yeah, we just worked out that way. And people come to me sometimes and say, do I have to go through an RLD? And my response to them, a couple of responses, or a couple of ways to respond to them. One, if you shouldn't feel like this. Yeah. So because I do think it does, and we talked about this, there's a lot of impact that we know about how we can improve the research design when we go through an RLD. And how we think about how to be more responsive to the community. You know, but if you have to think of it as more of a compliance issue, if you get federal funding, yes, you have to get an RLD approval. If you want to get published, you probably want to get RLD approval because it probably makes your chances a lot better with a peer-reviewed journal that you have someone who has approved the process. But if we're doing a program evaluation, you know, you just want to see how well the program works, and you're not necessarily like trying to make a generalizable knowledge, which is what research is supposed to be doing. It gets into another conversation about how you define research. Because I mean, even with ILD professionals, it's like, is this research? Is this not research? You know? Then I would say, you know, you don't have to go through an RLD. But again, it's a mechanism. It doesn't mean you shouldn't get people involved. Right? So if I'm doing a need assessment in the community, do I need to go through an RLD? If you're using it for your own planning, you probably don't need to go through an RLD. But at the same time, it doesn't mean you should not involve the community in designing a community responsive, community inclusive soil assessment process. So. Yes, but it is work, and it might delay what you want to do because it might take. This is what usually happens. It must be the time frame of how it happens. Someone needs a couple of weeks at least to prepare the application. Okay, so that's 2 weeks. They give it to me. You probably heard some of these horror stories. Still going on today, so might be made a little bit better, but before it used to be a lot worse. And so the institutions decided to have a process whereby a group of people will decide whether or not districts have IRB, so if you want to do research with students, you have to submit your proposal to the school district, and the school district have to make sure that you're not harming the students. So there's all of that, but I think over the years, because a lot of scandals, a lot of people die because of research, it become more and more what you guys were talking about this morning, right? More about covering your ass than really protecting the research. So this is why I think that's one thing we should have to and it's being recognized the same way that academic-based or university-based IRBs are, which is that we're registered with the Department of Health and Human Services. And they have the division called OHRP, Office of Human Research Protection, that you have to register with. And there's some requirements about an IRB. In an IRB, you should have at least one community member. That's the minimum. And usually with university-based IRB, you have one. That was it. And with our community-based IRB, we make sure that we have 9 members right now, and all of them are working in the community. 2 of them have PhDs. So we want to make sure that we have someone who has scientific rigor as well. You know, we look at a project and say, this is sound from a scientific point of view. We want to make sure that people are also familiar, have a focal competence to review projects from a community perspective. So even the other staff members who work in these community-based organizations, they are often coming from the same communities that they serve. So, and all of them have practiced, who have been part of a community-based research process at one point or another. So it brings you that perspective as well. And we meet about 3 to 4 times a year, depending on when we get a proposal. We have very small IRB. I went to an IRB professional conference a few years ago, and it was huge. I mean, it was in Boston, it took over the convention hall. I have no idea. When you think about it, like some university has 1 IRB, some university like UCLA have 5 IRBs, so and these people and these offices are staffed, and so there's a whole industry out there that I have been doing the IRB for about 4 or 5 years. I have no idea until that point. So with our IRB, you have a chair who is part of the board. We also have a vice chair, which is not required. But what happened is for us is our IRB members of community-based organizations who sometimes submit their own research project for review. So if the chair submits a proposal for review, she cannot be the decision-making process. So the vice chair is that. So that's why that's vice chair. And I'm what you call an IRB administrator, so I'm an IRB aspirant. Since we only do 3 or 4 reviews, it's not 100% of my job. Actually, it's a very small portion of my job. And every agency, every IRB also has what they call an institutional official, who's usually the director, the executive director of the community-based organization, or the president of the university, or some sort of administrator in the hospital. That person is not part of the IRB decision-making process, but they are just sort of the head of the agency who sponsors the IRB.
So you're talking about a community IRB would have an institutional official.
Right. Usually when you
ED of some.
Yeah, so our SSGED is the institutional official, although she doesn't come to meetings. He doesn't, well, not that he's barred from coming to meetings, but he doesn't. And he is not part of the IRB discussion.
So then why do you need?
It's sort of like a person that will sign things, it's sort of like, it's a bureaucratic title more than anything. I've never seen anyone ask for it. So, it's what they call institutional official.
So even if it's a community IRB, you need to have an institutional official. And that's just
Yeah. It doesn't prevent him from getting more involved. I'm just saying that it's more of a figurehead more than anything.
So this community IRB is situated in one community-based organization. So does this only review proposals that come for that organization?
It's up to you. It's really up to you. Our IRB, it's a capacity issue more than a requirement issue. So we do it case by case basis, but we definitely will review proposals coming from our own internal programs, their partners, community partners, and also the organizations whose the IRB members whose organization they belong to. So this is our target point, right? So we have other people, other organizations, but that's more case by case basis. If you don't have anything on the docket, we'll be happy to provide a service. Some of our projects are academic community partnership. Some of them are community initiated research that has no academic partners, but they want to go through that process. So there's an application process, so people have to write the application, and then I will get the application. Actually, there is a conversation between me and the potential applicant to make sure that we have the right fit for them, because there's certain expertise that we don't have, and it doesn't make sense for us to do that. We got, and it's usually local. We have gotten a request from, I think, South Carolina. It is a research project that studies the rural population, and we don't have expertise with that, so we're debating whether or not that we have the right fit. They still want us to review because they don't have any options. They don't really trust the university that in the region, So they wanted us to be the one to review the process. And I'll tell you about my process. The process of reviewing, that makes it not necessarily a big problem in this case, even though we're not familiar with that population. So we get the application, I give my community members, some of my board members, sometimes we do it, usually 3-4 weeks to review, and then we come together. Now, typical, I don't know how many of you are familiar with university-based IRB, but a lot of times you submit the application, you don't hear from them maybe for a couple of months, maybe longer, and then you get a letter saying, great, if you change this, and change that, we'll approve you. Or we send it back and we'll approve you. So we find it to be a very disempowering process, because a lot of times you get this letter, and they ask you to change certain things, and you're like, why did they ask us to change that? Or we really think that we should do it the way that we intended because of our expertise and relationship with the community. But we can't really, we didn't express that because we didn't think that was an issue in the application, right? So it's not a very open process. So we try to change that with our own process. That when we meet, we actually invite the applicant to come to the meeting, and we have a dialogue about the research design and why we have questions. We always have questions. It's a tough crowd, I have to say, because they have all their community-based research. I always tell the applicants, if they ask you tough questions, it's not because they know the answer and you don't, and they're trying to trip you up. It's because they've done it and they have their way of doing it. It was a challenge for them, and they want to know what they're doing. So this is the capacity building thing. It's really about sharing best practices. And this is why the IRB members keep coming back. We added 2 members to the IRB in the last couple of months, but the 7 people who were on this board were the same 7 people that started in 2004. And they didn't want to get up or don't let us off the board. And because I think they learned so much even being able to do it, that inform what they do. So, and plus it's not really demanding on the schedule. It's 3 to 4 times a year. It's not necessarily too demanding.
So this is a community campus partnership proposal application. Does the university? I mean, the university has to review it as well. So how does that work?
How the 2 IRBs? Okay. So that's a really good question. Let me finish the process and then I'll get back to that. No problem. This is good to know. So what happened is, we have a discussion, we have a dialogue. So when someone leaves the room, they always know why. We will say, like, these are things that we want you to change, that require changes, and these are things that we recommend you to think about a little bit more. It's not contingent on your approval, but we would like you to think about it. So every time someone walks out of the room, they know what needs to be changed. They still get a letter saying this is that's a documentation. But it's not like wait 2 weeks and we'll get back to you. They know exactly what they, in fact, they start making the changes before I write a letter to them. You know, so it makes it process a little bit quicker too. And it's not disempowering. You know, if you don't agree, so they have a form to advocate for why you decided to do things the way. Right? So, and it's a great learning experience. And if you have an academic partner, you make both partners come at the same time. First, we want to see what that partnership dynamics are. You know, is the academic partners driving everything? Does the community partners have any input into what gets researched? You know, this is another way for us to empower the community partners too, so that they see themselves as equal footing with the academic partners. And then, so we never approve the project outright. We usually give them, and we never deny a project either. We never say, you know, this is a terrible idea, don't do it. We always do what we call contingent approval. Some contingent approval is longer than others, but you know, it's always a contingent approval. And then it's up to them to turn everything back for us, and then we designate 2 people on the board to review it, so the whole board can come back together. And the 2 people review the materials, and they can give the final approval to the administrative committee. So in the cases of where she talked about where the academic partner has to go through their own university-based RLD, you know, because especially if they are the ones who need the funding to get the funding, right? Now the community partner can say to them, the partner say, that's great, but you also have to go to the community RLD or else we won't play. So this is another way for us to advocate for the community partner, right? So yes, they have to go through 2 different processes. We talked about this yesterday about what if there are conflicts.
Yeah.
Our colleagues in Hawaii, I think they were dealing with a lot of biomedical research stuff and just blood and even hair. You know, about hair specimens. It's such a sacred part of that native population that you know there's a lot of conflict sometimes in terms of how to handle that type of material. We specialize in more social behavioral kind of research, social educational research. So I think the potential for conflict is not that big. And I can give you an example if you want to hear it. That I can remember after I told her that. And frankly, a lot of times the institutions are looking at different questions in the community. You know, so I don't want people to think that it's always in conflict. It's just we're looking at different things. And I can tell you what some of those things are. We talked a lot about like, you know, in universities, dissemination means getting published, going to conferences. In community, dissemination means sharing back with the community. Right? So we asked them, how do we plan to share your findings with the community through the application? We haven't talked about it. If you have a community partner, that should not be a difficult thing. Right? If the community partner felt empowered and felt ownership of the data, they could do, I mean, it doesn't fall only on the academic shoulder to share the data because the community would be empowered to do that on their own. The other thing that we asked that the community institution-based RP done is how is the community involved in the research process. And with that, we don't really tend to review projects where community is just being asked to be the outreach and recruitment tool for the research project. Because a lot of times that's what we are to them. That we have special access to a relationship with a population that they otherwise would not be able to get to, and they want us to be recruited for them. They don't want us for anything else. They don't want you to get involved in what questions are being asked, whether or not the tool is too long or the language is right. You know, they don't want any of that. We want to make sure that, like, if you want to play, this is the process we need to go through. That everything is subject to community approval. You know. So we looked at different things, you know, and usually the changes that the university wants you to make and the changes that you requested are not that it's not contradicting. It's just different. That's in our experience. So that it hasn't created as many conflicts as I hear from other folks who might look at this, who might review different types of research. But yeah, but we help too. Now, I also have projects where the community practitioners say, do I have to do your IRB too? If I feel the other thing that I wanted to say too, is IRB is just one mechanism for doing community review, and it doesn't have to be the only one, it's not always the best one, you know, like some of the stuff that, like the Pittsburgh folks do, and I think it's great, they're not an IRB, they're part of the university, they're review, they're advisory, you know, but they have a great relationship with the IRB actually tell people, tell the investigators, you know, you need to talk to this group of folks before you come back, or before you start the IRB process. So that's a great mechanism. That's
Okay,
also
explain
available.
that mechanism, I don't.
So they have this, I forgot what it's called, remember? What group that group is called? So they have this advisory board, right? That is actually part of the university. The university created that board. And this board is, the volunteer board members are people from the community. And they will come together every month during lunchtime for like an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half tops. And they will review up to 2 projects each time. And they will tell, and the investigators were there. And they would, I feel like I'm, misrepresenting that, but maybe
No,
we
but
can,
you're saying it right, because
Yeah.
they give them a voice, they give them like 15 to 20 minutes to discuss, they don't let them use PowerPoints. And then they,
they use PowerPoint.
They don't let them use the PowerPoints, they let them discuss what their projects is. And then they'll, ask them questions, how much the cost, and all the other things. And this is during their lunch break. And then they'll tell them if there's something that they think they should increase or decrease or enhance or put in or what have you. And then they'll come back later to see how that worked out with them, and then they might go on to the IRB with that. Or either they went to the IRB with it, and IRB said, well, you need to go back, like I said, and then they'll come back to the IRB.
So this group is for the whole university, for all types of research in the whole university?
Well, for research, that's in the community.
In their community.
Right, but it's all, like, anything that's like,
Yeah.
type research goes through this one group.
They started out with really focusing on African American communities, but they are expanding to looking at research in the Latino communities too. So they actually get referral from the university IRB to go through this process. So they're very tied to one university. So that's a different model. And I think it's very unique to that circumstance where you have, I think the IRB chair or director was probably a lot more forward thinking or more community inclusive than you even think of having this type of, so they've been doing it for 10 years, and they have a list of like 60, 70 projects that they have reviewed.
And it's a group of 29. It's not like a group of 10 or 12, it's 29 in the group. And if 5 leave, if they don't have the time, if 5 more recruited, they have that kind of system going on within that group.
And they're all community-based representatives of community-based organizations.
Right. Mm-hmm. And they are working.
Residents or?
Residents and working. They work for the community. Because there's a nurse or a doctor or someone that's part of the chair, chairs the meeting and everything. She works in the hospital. She's like a part of it, and so they're all part of it. But then there's doctors and different parts of it, but they probably live in a community and work there.
Yeah. So for me, the question is, how do you involve community? How do you give them a space to review research project, research ideas, right? To make sure that it's not harming and it's bringing the maximum use or benefits to the community. So what does that structure look like for your community? It might be an RV, it might not be an RV. You're still trying to figure out in what situation RV makes sense, in what situation it doesn't make sense. So I have to say, like, there are maybe only a handful of community-based RVs in this country, and but 10 years ago, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation. So I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. Now there are different models that we can look at. Like we are talking about a hybrid model, and, so it's very exciting because now we have all this experience and we can have these conversations about the RVs rightly. Right? So this is great. Let me tell you a couple of things that like our IRB really look at when we look at the community research process, and this is follow along. Let me find it. Okay, we talk about caseload. Uh, These are the kind of projects that we're in. Okay, so one of the things that we looked at is a lot very close is the informed consent process. Informed consent basically means that whenever you invite someone to participate in a research project, they need to know what's going to happen to them so that they can make an informed decision whether or not they want to participate. So voluntary participation is a key tenet of community-based research. You cannot coerce people to be in a research project with you. And informed consent is the place where you let people know the important information they need to know. So we all have different ideas of what's important for someone to consider, right? So when you are an academic researcher, when you might not think about certain things that community researchers think about. For example, if I were a provider and a researcher, I need to think about, what does it mean for someone to say no to me? Are they going to think about that that's going to jeopardize our relationship? If they're currently receiving services from me, and I'm asking them to participate in research, they feel comfortable in saying no. Right? So in informed consent, I need to tell them that, if you say no, you can still receive all the services that you're eligible for. And you can stop anytime you want and still be receiving these services. You will not be penalized for not participating. They need to know that. So that needs to be spelled out. That's not something that an institutional-based researchers have to think about that much, right? Because they don't have that relationship. They're not providing a service to you. So that's something that we're looking at really crazy.
No, I'm just trying to get the understanding. You said that's not what the institution has to.
If I'm a faculty, if I'm a university-based researcher, and I come up to you and say, Lawson, would you like to participate in this focus group? And then you said, who the hell are you? No, I don't know you. No. And then I can do anything to you. Right?
Without the consent.
But no, I can do, there's no consequences in saying, there's not that much consequence saying no to you. Because I'm an academic researcher.
Okay.
But if you're getting some services from me, and I come and ask you, hey, that's,
I understand.
yeah. So
I
there's
feel
something.
this intimidation about,
Yeah.
I may not get this services or that service.
I can bad say no because Eric is so
Couldn't say no.
nice to me. Eric did this for me last month, and if I say no, maybe he won't do that for me next month. Maybe I can just terminate me from this program. So all these things were sort of going through in someone's head, potentially. So we need to spell out and say, don't worry, this is a research project, and your receiving services have nothing to do with this. So it's not contingent on your participation in research. So that's something that we want to make sure. You might be asking the really sensitive topics, especially for us. A lot of research is dealing with sometimes torture victims. So we always like to tell people what the research is about, and sometimes we list sample questions that they might be asked. So it's one thing to ask, we're going to be asking about your sexual behavior, which is pretty sensitive. But then sometimes we even ask them to include a question that you might ask. You might ask you how many partners you have. So they can still refuse to answer that question. But if they know so specifically what that means, then they might make a better decision about what they want to, whether they want to participate. So that's something that we contact people information. It's really clear that people need a place where they can go to if they felt like they were mistreated. So oftentimes I am the name on the consent form. So if we approve a project, then if there's something that happens, then it will go directly to me because I'm a third party in this case. Length and format of go ahead.
Sorry,
Please.
on that note, you said you're a third party, like for that, if there's mistreatment, who would you recommend as a third party? Who would you select as a third party?
Typically, it depends. It can be the project director if you have a large project that the data collection staff is really different. It's reporting to the director. The director needs to know what the data collectors are not, or the researchers, the field researchers are not doing a good job. But it could be negotiated.
But that's usually
things are running the way it's supposed to run, and it's not, then that needs to be a red flag, right, whoever those people are.
So a lot of times we saw serve as the, I say third party too, it's like if we, if, you know, if we want to make sure that, if we have an academic partner that we don't have a long relationship with, then, yeah, that might be wrong.
So should there just be one, or should it be two?
It should be at least one. If you want to, that's fine. There's no rules against that. You know, once you have two, if you're studying a population with different language, you can have to be doing a different one.
Right, I just
If I
think-
speak Spanish and I'm putting down someone who doesn't speak Spanish as a contact person, that's not gonna happen.
Yes.
So the language is a big deal too. You know, a lot of things to work with. We tell them how the data is being used, which is not because I think with institutions, you assume that we get the research, we get published. That's just how it is. Right? But because we really focus on how the big data gets back to the community, so we tell them this is how we. And it matters because if I get published in some journal or go to an academic conference and say some, not that I should, but if I say something, chances are my peers in the community, I'm not going to hear about it. But if you don't disseminate the right way to protect the confidentiality of the subject, and you go to community and start talking about this stuff, then yeah, I mean, it has ramification on community members. So that's something else that we also look at too. You know, it's one thing to get published in a journal, but when you think about dissemination, what additional safeguard about confidentiality you need to think about? Length and format. A lot of times, consent form reads like a contract, very legalese. We try to, we wouldn't approve anything like that actually. We kind of like a Q&A format. Definitely lay language. We even have discussion about whether or not to use the word research in a consent form. It depends. We had this conversation yesterday about the word research. Right? We try to tell people to keep the consent form in 2 pages, which is a challenge because there are a lot of things that you need to think about putting down in the consent form.
It's something that they can read and understand themselves, so when they sign, they're signing something that they can read and say, I understand it. Now someone, you read it to them and they say, okay, I signed it, well, they have to understand.
Yeah. So it's not something like, if it's 8 pages, probably they read the first 2 pages and skip the rest. So you don't want that. About language should be conversational and non-scientific. It should be translated. Definitely, if you're working with a population whose primary language is not English, then you have to provide interpretation. And then we put down verbal consent because sometimes we work with populations that are highly illiterate or have high consent level, so a consent form doesn't really do them any good in written format. So we have to think about how to use it.
So you do verbal?
Sometimes we make an exception and do verbal consent.
So what do you do? Just tell them exactly word by word what it is, and then they say yes or no.
And then you document it. Yeah, usually at the third party.
Then they sign it.
I don't remember what we decided.
Do they verbally just say yes, and I'm just assuming that.
We usually ask them like before you ask them to sign, say, do you have any questions?
Right.
Is there anything, you know, and we sort of make sure, we ask them to not go through like 2 pages or 3 pages and then ask them any questions. Each section. Not in each section, if you have any questions. I'm talking about risk and benefits, risks. You know, you understand what those risks. You know, so it's a long process. But you know, we need to do it right, right?
Right.
You have any integrity.
Right, because they sign off on it even though it's verbal. They don't just say yes and that's a consent, right? They have to sign off.
They have to sign up on something.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
not
what-
as a signature.
Yeah.
It might be just.
An X, or, well, I mean, but that's their signature. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It gives something to say that they validate whatever you say.
Yeah.
How does this type of consent form go over with the university?
We haven't had any complaints.
Really?
You know, but the thing is with IRB is they've been struggling with this for a long time. I mean, if you go to IRB professional conference, they have a lot of sessions on consent forms. And they have like, they understand why you want to make it understandable. That doesn't mean that doesn't exist. I mean, you have
I guess,
to think about like, I'm one IRB is the CEO. maybe
Yeah.
research projects, so, and we kind of handpicked out, not handpicked, but we have an audience that, you know, that come to us with, I think majority of times we're pretty solid relationships, you know, so, again, if you ask my colleagues, how are you, she might tell you all kinds of things. So, yeah.
But if somebody comes from the Manhattan or Queen area, you have to turn them away, you can't do that. You have to take a Bronx, but you prefer them to live in the Bronx area.
You can turn them away for research, which is what we call eligibility. Yeah, so you can, from consent form, you can say, we're looking at blah, 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 who lives in this area, who is of this, could be gender sometimes, you know, racial or ethnic background, that's the research that we do. Yeah. Yeah. Because you don't want to waste their time. You don't want to look at the data. So,
How can you, me, as a member of the Bronx Cram, get to the IRB?
get to the IRB in what sense? As an IRB member or?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that depends on the IRB. That depends on the IRB. You know, so.
Who would refer?
Oh,
We don't know who is there. So do your referral to the IRB.
So the way we do recruitment is by the existing relationship of assisting the agency and also the IRB members recruit others. You know, so they go through a vetting process. But that again, that's not necessarily there's no regulations on how you select IRB members. So just because we do it this way doesn't mean other people do it this way as well. You know, I can tell you some of the criteria that we use is someone who understand community-based principal research. We've done at least one project. You know, so they're involved in some way. You know, so yeah, so that's part of our needs. And have some experience.
So we can get that sense of who is really.
So I mean, we do a lot of training of community members to do research. I feel like the IRB is sort of that next phase of deepening understanding. You know, so that's just how we see sort of this trajectory of the community research experience. So that's the kind of no, I don't think so. Big criteria, you know, I mean, someone who, yeah, I think the other thing is we want to, LA is a very diverse place. You know, I think, you know, the person from the Indian tribe, there's some population based on IRB. So like the Indian nations have their own IRB. You know, Hawaii, they're really looking at Native Hawaiian and Hawaii. So they don't have to think about diversity the same way that I have to think about diversity because of the different programs that we have and partners that we have. So I want to make sure that, you know, it's not all Latinos, it's not all Asian Americans, you know, and make sure that it's really like be able to handle some of the local competition. It is possible that, you know, if there's a project that you don't know anything about, you can bring in an expert to work with you to help you. They have no voting power, but they can tell you, like, you know, yes, you know, in this community, you don't want to use this word. Yes, in this community, this is how you should do outreach. These are the trusted people. You know.
So what are they, like a community liaison or something?
You're just an expert. So you bring in on a case-by-case basis. If you don't feel comfortable, if I read the proposal saying, you know, I think, you know, we need someone from the outside to help us, you know, there's no, sometimes we do open our meetings to other community members who want just to observe the process.
Would they do community board people or?
No,
Just community members?
like, you know, we're thinking about starting a RD, we're thinking about submitting a proposal on RD, and we check out roles.
Oh, okay.
It's part of capacity building. they're part of the decision making. They see the decision making process. It's pretty open. So there are different levels of academia recognition too, I think, and also different types of hierarchy. I have to say, my colleagues in the Indian nations in Hawaii, they are not surprised to the university. And we have, there are folks like who, you guys were working with one university right now, right?
Yeah.
So, and also the Pittsburgh is working with one university, so at least that university know who you are. Right? But outside of that, I don't know. We are pretty generalists. We don't work with one university, so so it's not easy in terms of our impact. In terms of recognition, it's really easy.
That's what makes your model a little bit different than somebody else's model that might be district one.
Right.
And yours is with multiple.
Right.
Somebody else's might be with two.
Right. And that's what Francisco was saying yesterday. Like whether or not you're thinking about expanding to more than one university. So it's a scope and capacity issue. Really. You handle more than one. It's strategic for you to handle more than one. So you just want to focus on building relationships.
Usually when IRBs
Sometimes. So when you
right, how would that be handled then in terms of
So an institutional-based hierarchy doesn't ask for a fee. The service is part of usually the indirect costs. This is why the probably 60, 70% of the indirect costs. Some of it goes to the hierarchy. And they have to review their own researchers' projects. That's part of the compliance. So if I am a faculty or even grad students doing research, I need to submit my proposal to my university's hierarchy. And they don't get charged for it. And so it's not built into the research budget. We don't charge. We saw this is our incentive, we don't pay our